At Thanksgiving, my son and daughter-in-law called me a thief in front of 40 family members. They pointed their fingers and demanded the police arrest me right there in the dining room, so I smiled and opened the thick manila envelope I brought with me. What happened next silenced the entire room and ended with federal agents kicking down the front door. I am Curtis. I am 73 years old, and I spent 4 decades hunting down the smartest corporate criminals in America. Before I tell you how I dismantled my own son's entire fraudulent empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe arrogant people always dig their own graves. It all started 6 months ago when my heart decided to skip a few beats. It was a minor scare, just a slight arrhythmia that landed me in the hospital for 2 days. My son Julian and his wife Chloe rushed to my bedside. They played the part of the deeply concerned family perfectly. They told the doctors I could not possibly go back to living alone in my small townhouse. They insisted I move into their brand new $2 million mansion in the wealthy northern suburbs of Atlanta. I thought my son actually cared about me. I thought the boy I raised as a single father after his mother Beatrice passed away was finally showing some gratitude for the decades of backbreaking sacrifices I made for him. But I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. The day I arrived at their massive estate carrying my 2 worn-out suitcases, I assumed I would be staying in one of their 4 luxurious guest bedrooms. But Chloe met me at the front door with a tight fake smile and a bottle of expensive air freshener in her hand. She did not even let me step onto the imported hardwood floors of the foyer. She looked at my bags and then looked at Julian. She told him right in front of me that my old man smell would completely ruin the aesthetic of her newly decorated guest wing. She said I tracked dirt and poverty wherever I went. She told my son that I belonged downstairs out of sight where her wealthy friends would not have to look at me when they came over for dinner parties. I looked at Julian, waiting for him to defend his father. I waited for the boy I put through college to tell his wife to show some respect. But Julian just looked down at his expensive Italian leather shoes and nodded. He grabbed my suitcases and led me straight to the basement door. They did not put me in a finished basement suite. They put me in the raw, damp, unfinished concrete cellar. It was cold. It smelled like mildew and old dust. There was a single bare light bulb hanging from the exposed wooden rafters and a cheap cot shoved into the corner next to the humming water heater. Julian muttered a weak apology, claiming it was just temporary until they could renovate. But I knew a lie when I heard one. I did not complain. I did not yell or demand respect. I simply nodded, unpacked my few belongings, and let them believe they had successfully dominated a helpless, frail, old man. You see, Julian and Chloe thought I was just a broke, retired government clerk. They thought I survived on a pathetic $1,200 monthly pension and a meager Social Security check. They treated me like a financial burden, a pathetic charity case they had to hide in the dark so I would not embarrass them. They had absolutely no idea who I really was. I did not spend my life pushing paper. I spent 40 years working as a senior forensic accountant for the federal bankruptcy courts. I was the ghost the government sent in when multinational corporations tried to hide their stolen millions. I spent my entire career tracking shell companies, dismantling offshore tax havens, and putting arrogant white-collar criminals behind bars. I made a very lucrative career out of finding money that people desperately wanted to keep hidden. And because I understood how money worked better than anyone else, I quietly built my own fortune. Through aggressive anonymous investments and decades of compound interest, I retired with an $8 million portfolio safely locked away in an invisible blind trust. I drove a 10-year-old sedan and wore cheap clothes because I learned very early in life that displaying wealth only attracts parasites. I let Julian and Chloe think I was poor because I wanted to see how they would treat me when they thought I had nothing to offer them. And they failed the test spectacularly. But I am a patient man. I settled into the cold, damp basement. I spent my days acting like a confused elderly father, shuffling around the kitchen to make my black coffee, and immediately retreating back down the stairs whenever Chloe entered the room. I let her make her condescending comments. I let her spray her air freshener every time I walked past her. What they did not know was that the unfinished basement was the absolute perfect environment for my actual work. Behind a wall of stacked cardboard boxes and old winter coats, I set up my personal workstation. I unpacked my encrypted federal-grade laptops, my heavy processing towers, and my multiple high-resolution monitors. I tapped directly into the main electrical line of the house to power my equipment without raising their utility bill noticeably. Then I went to work. The first rule of forensic accounting is that proximity is power. By forcing me to live in their house, they placed me directly inside their private digital network. It took me less than 10 minutes to intercept the wireless router signal for the entire mansion. I bypassed Julian Week's security protocols and gained full administrative access to every single piece of data flowing through their home network. I wanted to see exactly how my son was affording a $2 million mansion and the fleet of luxury cars sitting in his driveway. Julian owned a mid-sized regional logistics company. It was successful, but it was not buy a mansion in cash successful. I started monitoring his incoming and outgoing network traffic. It did not take long for the numbers to reveal the truth. 3 weeks after I moved into the basement, I was running a routine packet sweep on a Tuesday night. The concrete walls around me were cold, but my monitors glowed with the warm light of raw data. I intercepted a massive automated clearinghouse transfer originating from Julian primary corporate account. I watched the data packets flow across my screen. $15,000 was being pulled out of his logistics company operating budget. At first, I thought it was a standard vendor payment, but when I ran the routing numbers through my decryption software, the destination account flagged immediately. The money was not going to a vendor. It was vanishing into a dark account held by a limited liability shell corporation based out of Delaware. I sat forward in my chair, the cold basement air completely forgotten. $15,000 a month is $180,000 a year. That is not a clerical error. That is systematic capital drain. I cracked my knuckles and deployed my federal tracing algorithms. I breached the Delaware corporate registry firewall and pulled the original articles of incorporation for the shell company receiving the funds. The company was named Curtis Holdings. My blood ran ice cold. Curtis is my name. I aggressively dug deeper, ripping through the digital layers of the Shell Corporation banking profile. I pulled the tax identification numbers. I pulled the registered agent documents. And then I found the ultimate betrayal sitting right there in plain black and white text. The entire fraudulent shell company was legally registered using my personal social security number. I sat back in my chair and stared at the glowing monitors. The sheer audacity of the crime took my breath away. My own son and his arrogant wife had stolen my identity. They had committed federal identity theft against a 73-year-old man. The entire picture snapped into brutal, agonizing focus. They had not moved me into their house because of my heart condition. They had not taken me in out of a sense of family duty. They moved me into their basement to establish my legal physical residency at this exact address. Julian was laundering massive amounts of corporate revenue through a fake company to evade paying millions of dollars in federal taxes. And when the Internal Revenue Service inevitably caught on to the missing money and launched a massive criminal audit, Julian and Chloe had the perfect scapegoat already set up. They were going to blame the missing millions on the confused, senile black grandfather living in their basement. They were going to tell the federal investigators that I had stolen the money and hidden it. They were building a paper trail designed to send me to federal prison so they could keep their mansion and their luxury cars. I looked around the damp, miserable basement they had thrown me into. They thought I was just waiting down here to die. They thought they had perfectly framed an ignorant old fool. A slow, dark smile spread across my face. They had absolutely no idea that they had just tried to frame a master architect of financial destruction. They had invited the wolf directly into their henhouse. I did not march upstairs and confront them. I did not scream or demand answers. A confrontation would only make them hide the rest of their tracks. Instead, I initiated a total stealth protocol on my network. I began quietly logging every single internet protocol address, every forged digital signature, and every hidden bank transfer they executed. I was going to let them build their fraudulent empire as high as they possibly could. I was going to let them feel like absolute untouchable gods. And then I was going to rip the foundation out from under them so violently they would never recover. The heavy basement door at the top of the stairs suddenly swung open. The bright light from the hallway spilled down the wooden steps. I immediately reached out and hit the kill switch on my monitors, plunging my workspace back into total darkness. Curtis Chloe shouted, her voice echoing down the stairwell, dripping with irritation and disgust. "I know you are awake down there." I quickly grabbed a dirty rag and wiped my hands, pretending to be cleaning old tools. "Yes, Chloe?" I called back, letting my voice sound raspy and weak. She marched halfway down the stairs, holding her nose as if the air itself was toxic. She kicked my plastic laundry basket that was sitting on the landing. "Listen to me, old man," she snapped. "Julian and I have been talking. You use our water, you use our electricity, and you take up space in my house. Starting on the 1st of the month, you are going to pay me $800 a month in rent out of your little pension check. If you miss a payment, I will pack your bags and drop you off at a state-run shelter myself. Do you understand me?" I looked up at her standing on the stairs in her expensive silk pajamas purchased with stolen money. I let my shoulders slump in complete defeat. "I understand, Chloe," I whispered, looking at the floor. "I will have the money for you." She scoffed in disgust, turned around, and marched back up the stairs, slamming the heavy door behind her. The deadbolt clicked into place. I stood in the dark basement and turned my monitors back on. The blue light washed over my face, revealing a cold, calculating expression. Chloe wanted $800 from a broke old man. She did not know she was demanding lunch money from the man who was about to seize every single asset she had ever owned. The hunt had officially begun. The damp, heavy air of the unfinished concrete basement chilled my aging bones, but the intense heat radiating from my heavy processing towers kept my hands perfectly steady. I did not sleep at all that night. I sat in my heavy ergonomic leather chair, bathed entirely in the pale blue glow of 4 high-resolution monitors. I had breached my son Julian wireless network with terrifying ease earlier that evening, but now I needed to go much deeper into the dark. I needed to access his primary corporate ledgers. A regional logistics company handling massive interstate freight shipments leaves a colossal digital footprint. There are massive payroll databases, complex fuel expenditure logs, and highly detailed vendor routing numbers. Julian thought he was incredibly clever by hiding his secondary financial servers behind a commercial-grade firewall. He bought expensive off-the-shelf security software designed specifically to stop amateur hackers and corporate spies. He did not realize he was up against a man who used to write the core decryption algorithms for the United States Department of Justice. It took me exactly 45 minutes to completely bypass his security protocols and establish a permanent undetected backdoor directly into his central accounting mainframe. I pulled the master ledgers onto my screens and began to follow the money. Forensic accounting is not about looking at the numbers that are sitting plainly on the page. It is about finding the negative space. It is about finding the numbers that are deliberately missing. Julian Logistics Company was highly profitable, but the profit margins reported on his official federal tax filings were incredibly narrow. I ran a customized cross-reference algorithm comparing his actual shipping manifests against his declared revenue streams. The discrepancy was absolutely massive. Millions of dollars were bleeding out of the company operating budget long before they ever reached the taxable bottom line. I traced the digital bleeding directly to the shell company I had discovered earlier in the night. The entity was named Curtis Holdings, LLC. I deployed a secondary scraping tool and pulled the original federal incorporation documents directly from the Delaware State Business Registry. I stared at the digital paperwork displayed on my center monitor, and my blood turned to absolute ice. There on the official government filing was my full legal name. There was my exact date of birth. And right there, sitting plainly in the registered agent identification section, was my personal social security number. My own flesh and blood had committed massive federal identity theft. Julian and his arrogant wife, Chloe, had forged my signature on dozens of binding corporate documents. They had illegally opened high-yield offshore holding accounts entirely in my name. Over the past 3 years, they had systematically and deliberately siphoned over $3 million in untaxed corporate revenue directly into Curtis Holdings. They were actively laundering the money through a complex web of fake vendor invoices and using the clean funds to finance their lavish, out-of-control lifestyle. The $2 million mansion sitting right above my head, the fleet of luxury imported cars sitting in the driveway, and the expensive designer clothes Chloe paraded around in were all paid for with stolen money tied directly to my personal identity. The sheer brutal magnitude of the betrayal settled heavily in the center of my chest. I leaned back in my chair and stared up at the exposed wooden rafters of the basement ceiling. I thought about my late wife, Beatrice. I thought about the decades I spent working 60-hour weeks to ensure Julian could attend the best universities without acquiring a single dollar of student debt. I thought about the day I had my minor heart scare 6 months ago. I thought about Julian sitting by my hospital bed, holding my hand and telling me how much he loved me. I thought about Chloe insisting with fake tears streaming down her face that I could not possibly live alone anymore and that I needed to be surrounded by family. It had all been an elaborate, highly calculated theatrical performance. They did not move me into their luxurious home out of a sense of familial duty or love. They moved me down into this damp, dark basement to establish my physical and legal residency at this exact address. The address legally registered to the fraudulent Curtis Holdings, LLC. Julian and Chloe were not stupid. They knew that laundering $3 million would eventually trigger an automated red flag within the Internal Revenue Service. They knew a massive federal criminal audit was completely unavoidable. And when those federal agents finally came knocking on the front door with search warrants and heavy steel handcuffs, Julian and Chloe had their absolute perfect defense completely prepared. They were going to play the role of the innocent, hard-working couple who had been completely deceived. They were going to point their fingers down the basement stairs. They were going to tell the federal investigators that the confused, senile black grandfather living in their cellar had secretly managed their books. They were going to successfully frame me as the sole criminal mastermind behind the entire tax evasion syndicate. My own son was completely willing to send his 73-year-old father to a maximum security federal penitentiary where he would surely die behind bars just so he and his wife could keep their stolen wealth and their exclusive country club memberships. A lesser man would have marched up the basement stairs right then and there. A lesser man would have kicked down their heavy bedroom door, grabbed his son by the throat, and demanded a furious explanation. But anger is a loud, careless, and highly destructive emotion. Anger makes you sloppy and leaves evidence. I did not feel anger. I felt absolute cold, mechanical resolve. I stood up from my desk, walked over to my small coffee maker, and poured myself a cup of black coffee. I stood in the dark shadows of the basement, drinking the bitter liquid and calculating my next exact moves. I could not simply erase the data or destroy their servers. I needed the fraudulent system to keep running perfectly. I needed them to feel incredibly safe and completely untouchable. I walked back to my workstation and initiated a total stealth protocol across my entire network. I set up automated data traps on every single server Julian owned. Every time Chloe logged in to transfer stolen funds, my software silently captured her unique internet protocol address and her specific device, media access control address. Every time Julian forged my digital signature on a fake vendor invoice, my system recorded his exact keystrokes and perfectly timestamped the fraud. I was building an airtight, inescapable federal indictment right under their feet. I was gathering enough irrefutable digital evidence to ensure they would never see the outside of a prison cell again. The trap was quietly set, and all I had to do was wait for them to walk entirely into the jaws of the beast. I spent the next 3 days living like a ghost in my own sun house. I maintained my perfectly crafted illusion of extreme old age. I shuffled my feet heavily against the floorboards when I walked. I purposely misplaced my reading glasses and wandered the halls looking confused. I let my hands shake slightly when I poured my coffee in the morning. I made absolutely sure Julian and Chloe saw exactly what they wanted to see. A frail, declining old man who could not possibly understand modern technology, let alone dismantle a complex corporate money laundering syndicate. On Thursday afternoon, I was sitting on my cheap, narrow cot in the corner of the basement, organizing my small pile of faded clothes. I had my encrypted monitors completely powered down and hidden carefully behind the stacks of heavy cardboard boxes. The heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs creaked open loudly. The bright, warm light from the main hallway sliced through the depressing gloom of the basement. I heard the sharp, aggressive clicking of expensive designer heels descending the wooden steps. Chloe walked down into the basement, holding her nose delicately with 2 fingers as if the very air I breathed was somehow contaminating her. She was wearing a pristine white silk blouse and tailored designer slacks. She was holding a brand new luxury leather handbag that I knew for a fact she had purchased with the money she stole in my name. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. I stood up slowly, leaning a trembling hand against the cold concrete wall for simulated balance. "Hello, Chloe," I said, letting my voice sound incredibly weak and raspy. "Do you need me to come upstairs and clean something in the kitchen?" She did not answer immediately. She walked over to my small plastic laundry basket sitting on the floor near the humming water heater. Without breaking eye contact, she casually swung her expensive shoe and violently kicked the basket. My neatly folded shirts and socks spilled out onto the dusty concrete floor. She smiled a cruel, highly satisfied little smile. "You are making a disgusting mess down here, Curtis," she said, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. "Julian and I have been talking about your living arrangements. You consume our expensive food. You use our hot water. You take up valuable square footage in my beautiful home. We are not running a free charity for the elderly." I looked down at my clean clothes scattered on the dirty floor and then looked back up at her. "I understand, Chloe," I murmured, keeping my head slightly bowed in submission. "I try very hard not to be a burden to you and Julian." "Trying is not good enough," she snapped sharply. "Starting on the 1st of the month, you are going to pay me $800 a month in rent. You will take it out of your little government pension check and you will hand it to me in cash. If you miss a single payment or if you start complaining to Julian about it, I will personally pack your cheap bags and drop you off at a state-run homeless shelter. Do you understand me, old man?" I looked at her standing there dripping in stolen luxury, threatening to throw me onto the street while she was actively using my identity to steal millions of dollars. The sheer blinding arrogance of her demand was almost poetic. She wanted to squeeze $800 out of the frail old man whose stolen identity was currently funding her entire pathetic existence. I nodded my head, slowly simulating complete and utter defeat. "I understand, Chloe," I whispered, staring down at her designer shoes. "I will have the cash for you on the 1st of the month. I promise I will not be late." She scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes in deep annoyance. "See that you do," she commanded, turning on her heel, "and pick up your dirty clothes. This place looks like an absolute landfill." She marched back up the wooden stairs, the sharp clicking of her heels echoing loudly in the enclosed concrete space. The heavy door slammed shut at the top of the stairs, and the steel deadbolt slid into place with a loud metallic clack. I stood alone in the dim light of the single bare bulb. I looked down at my laundry on the floor, but I did not bend down to pick it up. I walked past the scattered clothes and moved the heavy cardboard boxes aside, revealing my hidden workstation. I powered on the monitors. The screens flared to life, illuminating my face in a cold, stark blue light. I brought up the real-time tracking logs of the Curtis Holdings offshore accounts. Chloe wanted $800 in cash. She wanted to assert her total dominance over a helpless old man. She had absolutely no idea that she had just demanded lunch money from the man who was meticulously engineering the absolute and terrifying destruction of her entire life. I cracked my knuckles and typed a new command into the terminal, locking the final tracking protocol onto her personal cell phone. The game was far beyond simple surveillance now. It was time to start tightening the noose. The cashier at the toy store looked at me with that familiar blend of pity and impatience. The digital card reader on the counter beeped a harsh, flat tone. Declined. I stood there holding a plastic-wrapped telescope. It was for my grandson, Leo. He was turning 8 years old tomorrow. Leo was the only pure thing left in that $2 million mansion. He was the only reason I tolerated the damp basement and the constant humiliation. He used to sneak down the wooden stairs at night just to show me his drawings of the solar system. I wanted to buy him the stars. I handed the cashier my only debit card tied to my small public checking account. It was the decoy account where my modest government pension was deposited. It was supposed to hold exactly $4,000. I knew exactly what was in there because I have never miscalculated a financial ledger in my entire life. "Please, try it again," I said, keeping my voice soft and deliberately fragile. The cashier sighed and swiped the card a second time. The machine flashed the same angry red message. Insufficient funds. I left the telescope on the counter and walked out of the store. I climbed into my rusted old truck in the parking lot and pulled out my cheap decoy smartphone. I logged into the basic banking application. The balance staring back at me was $0.00. I clicked on the transaction history. A massive unauthorized withdrawal had been executed at 8 o'clock that morning. The entire $4,000 had been digitally transferred to a private account registered to my daughter-in-law, Chloe. She had not just stolen my identity to launder millions in corporate tax fraud. She had actually logged into my personal checking account and wiped out my meager, visible life savings. She stole the money I was going to use to buy her own son a birthday present. I drove back to the sprawling estate in the northern suburbs. I did not storm through the front doors. I walked quietly through the side entrance and stepped into the massive, open-concept kitchen. The countertops were made of imported Italian marble. The appliances cost more than most people earn in a year. Chloe was standing at the massive kitchen island. She was eagerly unboxing a brand new designer handbag wrapped in pristine tissue paper. The leather was immaculate. The gold hardware gleamed under the recessed lighting. My $4,000 was sitting right there on the counter in the shape of a superficial luxury accessory. Julian, my own flesh and blood, was leaning against the stainless steel refrigerator, swirling a glass of expensive amber bourbon. He looked completely relaxed, totally unbothered by the fact that his wife was bleeding his father dry. I shuffled into the kitchen, leaning heavily on the marble counter. I forced my hands to shake. "Chloe," I said, making my voice sound incredibly weak and confused. "I was just at the store trying to buy Leo a birthday gift. The bank told me my account is completely empty. Did you move my money by mistake?" Chloe did not even look up from her new handbag. She casually tossed the tissue paper into the trash and ran her manicured fingers over the expensive leather. She let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "It was not a mistake, Curtis," she said, her tone dripping with absolute condescension. "You have been living in my house for over a month. You use our hot water. You eat the food from our refrigerator. You consume our electricity. You did not honestly think you were going to live here for free, did you? I took what you owed us for rent." I stared at her. I looked at the $3,000 bag sitting on the counter. "But Chloe," I whimpered, playing the broken victim flawlessly. "That was my entire pension. That was all the money I had in the world. How am I supposed to buy my medication? How am I supposed to buy Leo his present?" Chloe finally looked at me. Her eyes were completely devoid of human empathy. She looked at me the way you look at a stray dog digging through your garbage. "That is your problem, old man," she sneered. "You should be down on your knees thanking me. Be grateful we let you sleep in the basement. Be grateful we do not pack your cheap bags and dump you in a state-run facility for the indigent. You owe us, Curtis. Remember that." I turned my head and looked directly at Julian. I looked at the son I had raised alone, the son I had sacrificed my own youth to protect. I waited for him to speak. I gave him one final, absolute chance to be a decent man. I waited for him to put his bourbon down and tell his wife she had crossed the line. Julian swirled the ice in his glass. He refused to meet my eyes. He looked at the floorboards and took a slow sip of his drink. "Listen to Chloe, Dad," Julian muttered, his voice weak and cowardly. "You have to pull your weight around here. Times are tough. We all have to make sacrifices. Just go back downstairs. Times are tough." He was standing in a $2 million mansion built on millions of dollars of laundered corporate funds stolen through a shell company registered in my name. And he had the absolute audacity to tell me that stealing my visible pension was a necessary sacrifice. In that exact moment, a profound shift occurred deep inside my chest. The last lingering shred of fatherly affection I held for Julian completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a cold, mechanical, and absolute resolve. I was no longer a disappointed father dealing with a misguided son. I was a senior federal operative staring at two ruthless criminals who had just signed their own death warrants. I lowered my head and nodded submissively. "I understand, Julian," I whispered. "I am sorry to be such a burden to you both." I turned around and shuffled slowly out of the kitchen. I heard Chloe laugh again as I walked away. She told Julian how perfectly the gold hardware on her new bag matched her shoes. They thought they had just asserted their total dominance over a helpless victim. They had absolutely no idea that they had just crossed the final unforgivable line. I walked down the wooden stairs into the damp, dark basement. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind me. I slid the heavy deadbolt into place, locking them out completely. I walked past my cheap cot and moved the stacked cardboard boxes aside, revealing my hidden federal workstation. I powered up my 4 high-resolution monitors. The pale blue light washed over my face. The frail, hunched old man was gone. I stood tall, my spine perfectly straight. My hands did not shake. My mind was executing tactical algorithms at lightning speed. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they had insulated their crimes perfectly. They thought throwing me in the basement and stealing my identity was a victimless crime because the victim was too old and stupid to fight back. I reached under my heavy desk and pulled out a secure encrypted satellite phone. I bypassed the standard cellular networks, entirely routing my signal through a closed federal relay system. I punched in a direct secure line to the United States Department of Justice headquarters in Washington. The line rang twice before a sharp professional voice answered. "Director of Prosecutions, Thorne speaking," the voice said. "Derek, it is Curtis." I said, my voice low, authoritative, and completely steady. There was a brief, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Derek Thorne was the most ruthless lead prosecutor currently operating in the Financial Crimes Division. He was a legal shark who tore apart corrupt hedge funds and offshore cartels for sport. But before he was a highly feared federal prosecutor, he was a young, struggling junior attorney. He was my personal protege. I spent 10 years teaching him everything I knew about tracking invisible money. Curtis, Derek said, his voice shifting instantly from professional detachment to deep respect. "It has been years. I thought you were enjoying a quiet retirement fishing somewhere in Georgia. What is going on?" "My retirement has been officially canceled, Derek," I replied, pulling up the raw data logs of the Curtis Holdings Shell Corporation onto my center monitor. "I need you to open a highly classified federal indictment file immediately. I am handing you a massive corporate money laundering and tax evasion syndicate on a silver platter." I can hear the clicking of Derek typing on his secure terminal. "Consider the file opened, Curtis. Who is the primary target? Who are we hunting today?" "The primary target is a regional logistics company operating out of Atlanta," I stated clinically, reading the precise tax identification numbers off my screen. "They are actively laundering millions of dollars through a dummy limited liability corporation. They are committing aggressive wire fraud, systematic tax evasion, and federal identity theft." Derek whistled softly over the encrypted line. "That is a heavy payload, Curtis. Do you have the evidentiary trail to back up the indictment? The courts need absolute proof for a raid of that magnitude." "I have everything," I said, my eyes scanning the endless rows of captured network data. "I have every single forged digital signature. I have the exact internet protocol addresses for every illegal transfer. I have the destination routing numbers. I am currently sitting directly inside their primary residential network, acting as a highly placed internal asset. I will package the entire digital footprint and transmit it to your secure servers by the end of the week." "Excellent," Derek said. "We will prepare the tactical raid teams and the asset seizure warrants based on your intelligence. Just give us the green light when you want the doors kicked in." "But Curtis, you never operate inside the target location without federal backup. This sounds highly personal." "Who exactly are these people?" I stared at the ceiling of the concrete basement, looking toward the kitchen where my son and his wife were currently celebrating the theft of my pension. "It is my son," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "It is my son and my daughter-in-law." There was a heavy pause on the line. Derek understood the gravity of what I was doing. He knew that I was actively turning my own flesh and blood over to the federal prison system. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Curtis?" Derek asked quietly. "Once I file this paperwork with the grand jury, there is absolutely no turning back. They will lose everything. They will do hard federal time." "They made their choice," Derek, I replied coldly, closing the banking application where they had stolen my grandson birthday money. "They decided to build their empire by burying an innocent man. Now I am going to bury them. Prepare the warrants. I will contact you when it is time to drop the hammer." I disconnected the call and placed the satellite phone back into its hidden compartment. I looked at the glowing data streams flowing across my screens. The trap was no longer just an idea. It was officially in motion. The massive, crushing weight of the United States federal government was quietly mobilizing in the background, waiting for my command. Julian and Chloe thought they had successfully ruined my life today. They thought stealing $4,000 made them powerful. They did not know they had just traded their freedom for a designer handbag. I sat back in my leather chair and began compiling the indictment files. The destruction of their entire world was now only a matter of time. The heavy steel door at the top of the basement stairs was locked, but the digital world was completely open to me. I sat in my ergonomic leather chair, surrounded by the heat of my processing towers. I had already gathered enough evidence to send my son Julian and his wife Chloe to federal prison for corporate tax evasion and identity theft. I had successfully transmitted the preliminary data packets to Director Derek Thorne at the Department of Justice. The raid was inevitable. But a senior forensic accountant never stops at the first layer of fraud. You never close the ledger until every single penny is perfectly accounted for. Julian had laundered over $3 million through the fraudulent shell company registered in my name. I knew exactly how much he stole from his own logistics company. I knew exactly how much he spent on the $2 million mansion sitting above my head. I knew the exact monthly lease payments for his imported sports cars and Chloe designer wardrobe. But when I ran the final aggregate reconciliation, the math simply did not add up. Julian was a greedy fool, but he was also a creature of habit. He liked to see his money. He liked to park it in domestic holding accounts where he could easily access it to project his false wealth to his country club friends. But according to my deep scan of his financial architecture, there was a massive gaping hole in his balance sheet. Nearly $4 million was completely missing from his primary domestic network. It was not in the mansion equity. It was not in the vehicles. It was completely gone. I shifted my focus away from Julian corporate ledgers. I targeted the secondary wireless node routing through the master bedroom upstairs. I locked onto Chloe, personal laptop, and her mobile device. She was an arrogant woman who believed she was intellectually superior to everyone around her. That kind of arrogance always translates into incredibly sloppy digital security. She used the same basic commercial password for every single one of her personal accounts. It took my decryption software less than 12 seconds to breach her private network and grant me absolute administrative access to her entire digital life. I opened her personal financial logs, and the missing pieces of the puzzle immediately snapped into a brutal, horrifying focus. Chloe was not just stealing from the federal government. She was not just stealing my identity and my modest pension. She was actively and systematically stealing from her own husband. I traced the missing $4 million. Julian thought the laundered funds were safely resting in a series of joint investment portfolios managed by a private wealth firm. But Chloe had secretly altered the digital routing instructions on the back end of the Curtis Holdings shell company. Every time Julian authorized a transfer to clean the stolen money, Chloe intercepted a massive percentage of the funds. She was bleeding him completely dry right under his nose. I followed the digital blood trail. The money was routed through 3 different proxy servers before landing in a highly secure offshore trust account in the Cayman Islands. I cracked the registration documents for the offshore account. It was entirely in her control. It was registered under her maiden name, Chloe Vance. Julian had absolutely no legal access to this money. He did not even know the account existed. I sat back in my chair and took a slow sip of my black coffee. The sheer clinical malice of her operation was staggering. She was systematically hollowing out my son's financial future while sleeping in the same bed with him every night. But a secret offshore account holding $4 million in stolen cash is not just a rainy day fund. It is a dedicated escape hatch. A woman like Chloe does not hoard that kind of capital unless she is planning to vanish completely. I opened her encrypted personal email inbox. I ran a targeted keyword search for international travel and real estate. The results populated my right monitor instantly. Chloe had recently finalized the purchase of a luxury flat in Geneva, Switzerland. The property was purchased in cash using funds routed directly from the Cayman Islands account. But it was the travel itinerary sitting in her inbox that revealed the true depth of her absolute betrayal. She had booked a one-way first-class ticket from Atlanta to Geneva. The departure date was December 1st. That was exactly 4 days after the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday. I stared at the electronic flight confirmation, and her entire master plan unfolded in my mind with terrifying clarity. Chloe was never planning to stay with Julian. She used him to build the fraudulent shell company. She used him to steal the money. She pushed him to move me into the basement to serve as the perfect legal scapegoat. Her plan was an absolute masterpiece of criminal sociopathy. After Thanksgiving, she was going to pack her expensive bags and leave for the airport. Once she was safely on the ground in Switzerland, she was going to anonymously tip off the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. She was going to hand the federal agents the exact location of the Curtis Holdings ledgers. The federal raid would crash down on the mansion. Julian would be caught completely off guard, holding the bag as the primary business owner. I would be dragged out of the basement in handcuffs, framed as the senile mastermind who registered the fraudulent shell corporation using my own social security number. My son and I would both be sent to federal prison for decades. Chloe would sit comfortably in her luxury flat in Geneva, sipping expensive wine. She would file for divorce in absentia, claiming she was the terrified, innocent wife fleeing a family of hardened criminals. She would play the ultimate victim while sitting on $4 million of untraceable cash. It was a flawless execution strategy designed to destroy my entire bloodline and reward her with absolute freedom. She truly believed she was the smartest predator in the jungle. She had absolutely no idea she was currently being hunted by an apex predator who wrote the manual on financial warfare. I closed the email files and wiped my digital tracks from her laptop. The original plan was to slowly gather evidence and let Director Thorne execute the raid on his own schedule. But the discovery of the December 1st flight itinerary changed the tactical landscape entirely. I could not afford to wait. If Chloe boarded that plane to Geneva, recovering the stolen funds would become an international jurisdictional nightmare. I needed to accelerate the timeline. I needed to force them to make a massive, undeniable mistake before the Thanksgiving holiday arrived. When you want to catch a rat, you do not chase it through the walls. You place a large piece of poisoned cheese in the middle of the floor, and you wait for its greed to overcome its caution. Julian and Chloe were already stealing my small pension check. They believed I was completely broke and entirely dependent on them for my survival. I needed to introduce a sudden, unexpected variable into their carefully controlled environment. I needed to show them a flash of cash so bright it would blind them to the trap I was setting. I opened a secure graphic design software on my primary terminal. I accessed a blank template for a standard monthly bank statement from a major national bank. I meticulously crafted a highly realistic financial document. I registered the statement under my own name. I created a fake transaction history showing a modest monthly pension deposit to maintain the illusion of my normal life. But then I added the bait. I created a single massive incoming wire transfer. I labeled it as a delayed disbursement from an old, forgotten federal retirement annuity. The amount I typed onto the fake statement was exactly $50,000. I made sure the formatting was absolutely flawless. I perfectly replicated the bank logos, the standard corporate disclosures, and the routing watermarks. To anyone looking at this piece of paper, it was undeniable proof that the poor old man living in the basement had just unexpectedly received a $50,000 windfall. I connected to my secure laser printer hidden behind the water heater and printed a single crisp copy of the document. I held the warm paper in my hands. $50,000 was nothing compared to the millions they were stealing. But to greedy, desperate people who view their family members as financial resources, free money is an irresistible drug. I folded the bank statement carefully, leaving the bold $50,000 deposit clearly visible on the top half of the page. I walked over to my cheap, narrow cot in the corner of the damp room. I placed the document directly on top of my small wooden nightstand next to my reading glasses and my blood pressure medication. It was sitting right out in the open, completely exposed. I knew Chloe and Julian periodically sneaked into the basement when I was upstairs making coffee. They searched through my few belongings looking for anything they could exploit. It was a gross violation of my privacy, but today I was counting on their lack of human decency. I checked my watch. Julian would be home from his logistics company in less than an hour. He was currently under immense pressure. The end of the month was approaching and he needed liquid cash to maintain his fraudulent vendor payments. His stress levels were high and his impulse control was completely compromised. I walked to the bottom of the wooden stairs and sat down on the bottom step. I wrapped my heavy cardigan around my shoulders, protecting myself from the cold, damp air. I looked back at the fake bank statement glowing white in the dim light of the bare bulb. I was about to find out just how low my son was willing to go. I was about to see if he would cross the final, unforgivable line to steal from his own father. The stage was perfectly set. The trap was armed. All I had to do now was wait for the heavy door at the top of the stairs to open. I sat on the edge of my narrow cot in the damp, cold basement, waiting for the inevitable explosion. I had purposely left the fabricated bank statement sitting completely exposed on my small wooden nightstand. I knew Julian had returned home from his logistics company because I heard the heavy, aggressive slamming of his luxury car door in the driveway. I listened to his heavy footsteps pacing back and forth across the hardwood floors directly above my head. He was stressed. He was financially drowning. His vendors were demanding payment, and his wife was secretly bleeding his accounts dry to fund her escape to Switzerland. A desperate man is a highly predictable man. He is a predator frantically searching for an easy meal. I heard the heavy deadbolt on the basement door slide back with a sharp metallic crack. The heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs did not just open, It was violently kicked open. The heavy wood slammed brutally against the interior drywall, shivering on its hinges. Julian stormed down the wooden stairs. His expensive tailored suit jacket was discarded. His tie was pulled loose, and his dress shirt was stained with nervous sweat under the arms. His face was flushed with a dark, violent shade of red. It was a terrifying mixture of uncontrollable rage and absolutely blinding greed. In his right hand, he firmly clutched the fake bank statement I had printed just an hour ago. He had sneaked down here while I was upstairs making tea, and he had taken the bait perfectly. He marched across the concrete floor and stopped just inches away from where I was sitting. He breathed heavily, his chest heaving with adrenaline. "What is this?" he demanded, shaking the crisp white paper directly in my face. His voice was loud and laced with raw hostility. "I asked you a question, old man. What is this piece of paper?" I forced my hands to tremble violently. I shrank back against the cold concrete wall, pulling my worn cardigan tightly around my shoulders. I widened my eyes and let my jaw drop in simulated terror. "Julian, please," I whispered, making my voice sound incredibly weak and raspy. "That is just my private mail. Please give it back to me. Please." "Give? It is just an old retirement account." "An old retirement account," he mocked, stepping even closer until I could smell the stale coffee and bitter stress radiating from his skin. "You have been living in my house for 6 months, eating my food and using my electricity. You sat in my kitchen this morning and let my wife demand $800 in rent from your pathetic government pension. You played the victim. You acted like you were completely broke, and all this time you had $50,000 sitting in a hidden account." I swallowed hard, letting a pathetic whine escape my throat. "Julian, that money is not for me." I lied perfectly. "That is an old federal annuity. I was saving it. I wanted to use it to pay for Leo college education when he gets older. It is for your son, Julian. It is for my grandson." The mention of his son did not soften his expression. It only fueled his desperate, arrogant fury. He reached out with his left hand and grabbed a fistful of my heavy cardigan. He hauled me roughly to my feet, pulling me up from the narrow cot. He shoved me backwards, slamming my shoulder blades forcefully against the hard, damp concrete wall. My tactical instincts screamed at me to drop my weight, pivot my hips, and shatter his knee. I had spent 40 years taking down cartel enforcers and corporate thugs who were twice his size and 10 times as dangerous. Julian was soft. He was a weak, pampered man who thought physical violence was a substitute for actual power. I could have ended his life right there in the dark, but I suppressed the highly lethal federal operative inside me. I locked him away and let the frail, terrified grandfather take the physical abuse. I needed Julian to feel like an absolute god. I needed him to commit entirely to his own destruction. "You listen to me very carefully, you useless old parasite," Julian hissed, pressing his forearm against my chest to pin me to the concrete. "My logistics company is facing a massive cash flow crisis this week. I have vendors threatening to cut off my supply lines, and I have a payroll deficit that I need to close immediately. I am not going to lose my business while you sit on $50,000 of useless cash in my basement. You are going to transfer every single penny of that money into my corporate operating account." I gasped for air, pretending that his forearm was crushing my lungs. "Julian, please," I begged, letting genuine tears of simulated agony pool in my eyes. "You cannot take that money. It is all I have left to give to Leo. I cannot give it to you. Please, do not make me do this." Julian leaned his face incredibly close to mine. His eyes were completely devoid of any familial love or basic human decency. The greed had completely hollowed out his soul. "You are going to give me that money," Julian stated, his voice dropping to a lethal mechanical whisper. "Because if you do not transfer those funds to my company tomorrow, I am going to pick up my phone and I am going to call Child Protective Services. I am going to tell them that my elderly father is suffering from severe dementia and violent psychotic episodes. I am going to tell them you leave the gas stove on and that you scream at the walls. I will tell them you are a direct, physical danger to my son." The threat hung in the cold basement air like a physical blade against my throat. He was crossing the ultimate moral boundary. He was weaponizing his own 8-year-old son to extort his father. "I will have a permanent restraining order filed against you by Friday morning." Julian continued, his lips curling into a cruel, victorious smile. You will be legally barred from ever coming within 500 feet of Leo again. I will pack your cheap bags, throw you out onto the street, and you will die alone in some state-funded facility without ever seeing your grandson face again. Now you tell me, old man. Is $50,000 really worth losing the only person in this world who actually likes you? I let my body go completely limp against the concrete wall. I allowed my chin to fall to my chest. I sobbed loudly, a broken, pathetic sound of total surrender. I let the tears spill over my cheeks and run down my wrinkled face. He had found my supposed weakness, and he had ruthlessly exploited it. Please, Julian. I cried, my voice shaking uncontrollably. Please do not take Leo away from me. He is my whole world. Do not call the authorities. I will give you the money. I will give you everything you want. Just please let me see my grandson. Julian let go of my cardigan and stepped back. He brushed his hands together as if he had just touched something highly contaminated. He looked down at me with absolute supreme disgust. That is what I thought, he sneered, smoothing the lapels of his expensive dress shirt. You will initiate the wire transfer to my corporate account the week of Thanksgiving. Do not try to delay it and do not try to hide any of it. If the money is not in my ledger by the time we carve the turkey, you will never see Leo again. Have a good night, Dad. Julian turned around and marched back up the wooden stairs. He walked with the heavy, confident strides of a man who believed he had just conquered the world. He reached the top of the stairs, slammed the heavy wooden door shut, and locked the steel deadbolt with a loud, definitive crack. I stood perfectly still in the dim light of the basement, listening to his footsteps fade away down the upstairs hallway. I waited until I heard the heavy door of his home office click shut. The tears on my face dried instantly. The trembling in my hands vanished completely. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back to relieve the tension from being shoved against the wall. A slow, dark, and absolutely lethal smile spread across my face. Julian thought he had just secured a massive financial victory. He thought he had successfully extorted a helpless old man. He did not realize that his threat against my grandson had just completely eradicated any lingering hesitation I had left in my heart. He had just signed his own federal death warrant. I walked over to my stacked cardboard boxes and pulled them aside. I powered up my 4 high-resolution encrypted monitors. The screens flared to life, casting a cold blue glow over my face. I opened the secure portal connected directly to the United States Department of Justice. I compiled the final data packets containing the offshore routing numbers, the forged corporate signatures, the captured internet protocol addresses, and the complete financial architecture of the Curtis Holdings money laundering syndicate. I addressed the digital payload directly to lead prosecutor Derek Thorne. I attached a single highly encrypted text file to the submission. The message was short and absolute. The target is fully compromised. The trap is locked. Prepare the tactical raid teams for Thanksgiving Day. I hovered my mouse over the execution command. I thought about the cruel, arrogant smile on my son's face. I thought about Chloe packing her bags for Geneva. I pressed the button. The files vanished into the secure federal network. The timeline was officially set. My son wanted his money on Thanksgiving. He was going to get a federal indictment instead. Thanksgiving was exactly 9 days away. The federal indictment files were locked in the Department of Justice servers. Derek Thorne was quietly assembling his tactical teams. But inside the $2 million mansion, the atmosphere was growing incredibly toxic. Chloe's wealthy, arrogant family was flying in from Connecticut. Her father, Donovan, was a loud real estate developer who demanded absolute perfection. But Chloe was not just preparing a holiday dinner. She was finalizing her escape to Geneva, and to make her perfect getaway, she needed to legally destroy my mind. She needed a paper trail of severe dementia to ensure I would take the fall for the $3 million they had laundered through my stolen identity. Chloe knew that a single accusation of memory loss would not hold up in a federal court. She needed a documented history of cognitive decline. She needed a pattern of dangerous behavior that would convince a judge to strip away my legal autonomy. So she began orchestrating a series of highly calculated psychological attacks designed to make me look completely incompetent. It started on a Tuesday morning. I went upstairs to the kitchen to take my daily blood pressure medication. I always kept my small plastic pill organizer on the far corner of the marble counter. When I reached for it, the Tuesday slot was completely empty. I know my own mind. I have an eidetic memory for numbers and routines. I had not taken those pills. I looked up and saw Chloe standing by the stainless steel refrigerator watching me with a cold, predatory gaze. She was holding a cup of expensive matcha tea. She asked me if I was looking for something, her voice dripping with fake concern. I told her I was looking for my pills and let a slight tremor enter my voice. I said I could not remember if I took them today. She lied smoothly, not even blinking. She told me I took them an hour ago. She said I really needed to be careful because taking a double dose at my age could stop my heart. She told me my memory was slipping terribly and that Julian was growing extremely worried about my mental state. I lowered my head and nodded, shuffling back toward the basement door. I did not argue. I let her feel like a master manipulator. What she did not know was that I had replaced my actual blood pressure medication with harmless sugar pills weeks ago, storing the real prescription safely in my locked federal workstation. I knew she was going to tamper with my medical routine. It is textbook elder abuse, and she was following the criminal manual perfectly. But hiding a few pills was not enough to build a binding medical case. She needed a major, undeniable incident. She needed a witness. She needed a crisis that proved I was an active physical danger to myself and others. 2 days later, the opportunity arrived. Julian was at his logistics company. The only people in the massive mansion were Chloe, myself, and the weekly housekeeper, a hardworking woman named Rosa. I was sitting at the small breakfast nook, slowly eating a bowl of oatmeal. Chloe walked past me into the kitchen. She glanced toward the hallway to ensure Rosa was busy vacuuming the formal dining room. I watched Chloe step up to the massive industrial gas range. Without turning her back to me, she reached out and twisted 3 of the heavy steel dials. She did not ignite the burners. She just let the raw, heavy natural gas begin to hiss softly into the kitchen. She immediately turned around and walked briskly upstairs to her master bedroom without saying a single word. I sat perfectly still. The unmistakable smell of sulfur and raw gas quickly filled the open concept kitchen. A normal man would have stood up and turned the dials off. But a federal operative gathering evidence of a criminal conspiracy does not interrupt a felony in progress. He documents it. Exactly 4 minutes later, Chloe came rushing down the grand staircase. She pulled her smartphone out of her designer pocket and hit the record button. She marched into the dining room and grabbed Rosa by the arm, dragging the terrified housekeeper into the kitchen. Chloe screamed loudly, holding her phone up to record the entire scene. She yelled that it smelled like gas and demanded to know what I did. She rushed over to the stove and dramatically twisted the dials off, making sure the camera captured her heroic action. Then, she pointed the lens directly at my face. Rosa stood in the doorway, covering her mouth in absolute shock. Chloe yelled at me, her voice trembling with perfectly simulated panic. She asked if I turned the stove on and forgot to light it. She said I could have blown up the entire house and killed us all. I looked directly into the camera lens of her expensive phone. I widened my eyes. I let my jaw drop. I raised my trembling hands to my face. I stammered, letting a pathetic, confused whine escape my throat. I said I did not know what happened. I said I was just eating my oatmeal and did not remember touching the stove. I apologized, over and over, telling her I was so confused. Chloe spoke loudly, making sure the microphone recorded every word, and making sure Rosa heard her clearly. She said this was getting out of control. She declared that I was completely losing my mind and that I was a danger to her family. She announced she was calling Julian because they had to get me medical help before I killed someone or burned their beautiful house to the ground. She stopped recording and shoved the phone back into her pocket. She looked at me with a smug, victorious smile. She had her digital evidence. She had her independent witness. She thought she had just successfully built the legal foundation to have me committed to a psychiatric ward. I kept my head bowed and shuffled slowly past her, retreating to the safety of my damp basement. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind me. I walked past the stacked cardboard boxes and powered on my encrypted monitors. I opened a specific hidden folder on my secure network. When I first moved into the basement 6 months ago, I did not just set up a workstation. I tapped into the mansion's massive security network. Julian had installed high-definition motion-activated cameras in every common area of the house to protect his stolen luxury goods. He thought he was the only one with administrative access. I pulled up the kitchen camera feed from 10 minutes ago. There it was in perfect, crystal-clear high resolution. The video showed me sitting quietly at the breakfast nook. It showed Chloe walking up to the stove. It showed her deliberately twisting the gas dials. It showed her walking away, willfully endangering everyone in the house just to frame an elderly man. Her fabricated evidence was nothing more than a poorly acted theatrical performance. My evidence was absolute undeniable time-stamped proof of reckless endangerment, criminal conspiracy, and felony elder abuse. She was trying to build a medical case against me to guarantee her safe flight to Geneva. She wanted to lock me in a padded room so I could not defend myself when the Internal Revenue Service came looking for their $3 million. She truly believed her smartphone video was the ultimate weapon. She did not realize she had just handed a former federal forensic accountant the exact video evidence needed to add 10 more years to her inevitable federal prison sentence. I saved the security video file, encrypted it, and forwarded it directly to the Department of Justice servers. I leaned back in my leather chair and took a slow sip of my black coffee. The trap was growing tighter by the hour. Chloe and Julian thought they were closing in on my total destruction. They were busy preparing the massive mansion for a luxurious Thanksgiving feast with their wealthy, arrogant family. They were planning to serve roasted turkey and expensive wine while celebrating the successful manipulation of a broken old man. They had absolutely no idea that the table was actually being set for their own financial execution. The evidence was secured. The federal agents were on standby. I just needed to survive the next few days playing the senile grandfather. When Thursday arrived, the entire fraudulent world they had built would burn to the ground right in front of their eyes. It was exactly 3 days before Thanksgiving, and the sprawling $2 million mansion above my head was buzzing with frantic holiday preparations. The heavy smell of roasted pecans, expensive sage, and imported wines drifted down the wooden stairs, seeping under the heavy steel door of my basement. Chloe was upstairs barking orders at the catering staff and preparing the house for the arrival of her wealthy, arrogant family. I sat in the cold, damp cellar listening to the chaos above. I knew their timeline was rapidly accelerating. Chloe was scheduled to board a first-class flight to Geneva in less than a week. She needed to finalize my legal destruction before the holiday turkey was even carved. The heavy deadbolt on the basement door slid back with a sharp click. The door swung open and my son Julian walked down the wooden stairs. He was carrying a sleek brown leather portfolio under his arm. He had styled his hair and put on his best cashmere sweater, playing the role of the highly successful, deeply concerned son. He walked across the concrete floor and stopped in front of my cheap, narrow cot. He forced a warm, gentle smile onto his face, but his eyes were completely dead. They were the cold, calculating eyes of a cornered animal preparing to sacrifice its own blood to survive a trap. "Hello, Dad," Julian said, his voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "I know it has been a stressful few days." After that terrible incident with the gas stove in the kitchen, Chloe and I had a long, serious talk. "We are just so incredibly worried about your declining health. We want to make absolutely sure you are protected in case your memory issues get worse or your heart condition acts up again." I looked up at him, keeping my shoulders hunched forward. I forced my hands to tremble, slightly resting them on my knees. "What do you mean, Julian?" I asked, letting my voice sound thin and extremely confused. He unzipped the leather portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of crisp legal documents printed on heavy bond paper. He held them out toward me like he was offering me a gift. "These are just some standard medical proxy forms," Dad, Julian explained smoothly. "It is a very common procedure for a man your age. It simply gives me the legal authority to speak to your doctors and make medical decisions on your behalf if you ever become incapacitated. It is just a safety net so Chloe and I can take proper care of you. All you have to do is sign the bottom page." I reached out with a shaking hand and took the heavy stack of papers. The lighting in the basement was deliberately poor, but I did not need bright light to spot a corporate death warrant. I am a retired forensic accountant. I spent 4 decades dismantling the most complex financial frauds in the federal justice system. I have read thousands of illicit contracts, shell company charters, and fraudulent liability waivers. I slowly turned the first page, pretending to struggle with the small print. I brought the paper close to my face, acting as though my vision was severely failing. But my eyes were perfectly sharp. I scanned the dense legal paragraphs with predatory speed. The document in my hands was not a medical proxy. It was a masterpiece of legal deception. Hidden beneath 2 pages of standard healthcare jargon was an absolute and irrevocable transfer of durable financial power of attorney. But that was not even the most toxic part of the document. Buried in the fifth section was a comprehensive corporate indemnification clause. It explicitly stated that I was the sole managing director of Curtis Holdings Limited Liability Company. It was a sworn legal confession that I had independently established the Shell Corporation and that I assumed total personal and financial liability for any and all tax discrepancies, debt obligations, or federal penalties associated with the entity. My own flesh and blood was standing in my basement smiling at me while handing me a signed confession for a $3 million federal tax fraud. Julian wanted me to legally admit to his crimes. He was handing me a suicide note and telling me it was a shield. The sheer, unadulterated evil of his plan was almost breathtaking. "Julian, this print is so incredibly small," I whispered, letting a pathetic whine escape my throat. "My eyes are just not what they used to be. The words are all blurring together. I do not think I can read this in the dark." "You do not need to read it, Dad," Julian said, his voice tightening with a sudden spike of impatience. "I just told you what it says. It is just medical paperwork. I already had my lawyers review it. Just sign the bottom of the last page so we can put this behind us and enjoy a peaceful Thanksgiving." He reached into his sweater pocket and pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. He uncapped it and thrust it toward my face. I reached out with my trembling fingers and intentionally bumped his hand. The heavy gold pen slipped from his grip and fell onto the dirty concrete floor rolling underneath the metal frame of my cot. "Oh, I am so sorry, Julian," I stammered, acting completely flustered and embarrassed. "My hands are just so clumsy today." "Let me get that for you." "Do not worry about it," Julian sighed, rolling his eyes in absolute disgust. He dropped to one knee and reached under the dusty cot to retrieve his expensive pen. That was all the time I needed. In the 2 seconds his eyes were diverted, I reached into the deep pocket of my heavy cardigan and pulled out my own pen. It looked exactly like a standard black ballpoint pen, but it was a highly specialized piece of federal-issue forensic equipment. The pen contained a custom synthesized chemical ink. When applied to standard paper, the ink bonds normally with the cellulose fibers, but after exactly 48 hours, the chemical compound completely oxidizes upon contact with the air. The ink entirely evaporates, leaving absolutely zero chemical residue or indentation on the page. It is a tool designed specifically for deep undercover operations. Julian stood up, wiping the dust from his knees and holding his gold pen. "Here you go," he said, holding it out again. "I already found my own pen in my pocket, Julian," I said, showing him the plain black plastic casing. "Show me where I need to sign to make you and Chloe feel safe." Julian smiled a greedy, triumphant smile. He flipped to the final page of the document and pointed to the solid black line at the bottom of the sworn affidavit. "Right there, Dad. Just sign your full legal name." I pressed the tip of my forensic pen against the crisp white paper. But before I moved my hand, I executed a secondary legal countermeasure. I pressed my left thumb hard against the sharp, jagged edge of my own thumbnail. I pressed until I felt the skin break and a tiny microscopic drop of blood formed on the pad of my thumb. As I gripped the edge of the document to steady the paper, I firmly pressed my bloody thumb into the bottom left corner of the signature box. In the high-stakes world of federal financial investigations, a bloody thumbprint discreetly placed on a legally binding contract is a universally recognized biometric marker of extreme physical or psychological duress. It completely invalidates the document in a court of law and instantly flags the opposing party for criminal coercion. I signed my full name across the line using the vanishing ink. I handed the thick stack of papers back to my son. "There you go, Julian," I whispered, dropping my head in absolute submission. "I hope this helps you and your wife sleep better at night." "It certainly will, Dad," Julian said, snatching the documents from my hand with terrifying speed. He did not notice the microscopic red smudge in the corner. He did not notice the faint chemical smell of the ink. He was entirely blinded by his own towering arrogance. He thought he had just secured his total freedom and guaranteed my total destruction. "Thank you," Julian said, turning his back to me without another word. He marched quickly up the wooden stairs, taking them 2 at a time. The heavy door slammed shut and the deadbolt locked me back in the dark. I walked over to the stacked cardboard boxes and pulled them aside. I powered up my 4 encrypted monitors. I immediately accessed the internal security cameras wired throughout the mansion. I pulled up the feed for Julian private home office on the second floor. I watched the crystal clear high-definition video as Julian walked into the office holding the documents high in the air like a championship trophy. Chloe was waiting for him sitting behind his massive oak desk. She jumped out of the chair and threw her arms around his neck. They kissed passionately, completely thrilled by their successful extortion of a frail old man. Julian walked over to an original oil painting hanging on the far wall. He swung the painting outward, revealing a heavy steel biometric safe bolted directly into the structural beams of the house. He pressed his thumb to the scanner, pulled the heavy steel door open, and placed the poisoned legal documents inside. He locked the safe and smiled at his wife. They truly believed they held the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. They believed they were completely bulletproof. I sat back in my leather chair and cracked my knuckles. They had made their final legal move. Now it was time to completely sever their escape route. I opened the secure portal connected to the international banking network. I navigated through the encrypted proxy servers until I reached the offshore banking node located in the Cayman Islands. I brought up the private holding account registered under Chloe's maiden name. The account holding the $4 million she had stolen from her husband. The account she planned to use to fund her luxurious new life in Geneva, Switzerland next week. Chloe thought she was a criminal mastermind. She did not understand that international offshore banks are highly allergic to federal scrutiny. They only protect your money as long as you remain a ghost. The moment the bright light of the United States Department of Justice shines on their ledgers, they instantly freeze the assets to protect their own institutional liability. I compiled a massive digital dossier containing Chloe-forged signatures, the illegal wire transfer logs, and the complete Internet protocol history connecting her device to the laundered funds. I bypassed standard reporting channels and submitted the dossier directly to the Financial Action Task Force database, triggering a Priority 1 international money laundering alert on her specific account number. I watched my center monitor as the automated global banking systems reacted to the federal alert. It took exactly 40 seconds. The status of Chloe Cayman Island account changed from active and liquid to a glowing red message. Asset freeze protocol initiated. Funds locked pending international federal investigation. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. The $4 million she had meticulously stolen was now completely encased in digital concrete. She could not wire a single penny. She could not withdraw a single dime. Her escape fund was absolutely completely dead. Chloe thought she was boarding a first-class flight to Geneva on Monday. She thought she was leaving me and Julian to rot in a federal penitentiary. She had absolutely no idea that she was currently trapped in a burning building, and I had just quietly, permanently locked the only exit door. The Thanksgiving guests were arriving in 3 days. The table was being set, the turkey was being prepared, and the massive crushing weight of the federal government was slowly, quietly descending over the roof of the $2 million mansion. The trap was absolutely inescapable now. I powered down my monitors and went to sleep, feeling perfectly and completely at peace. I sat in the dark basement, planning the psychological destruction of my son and his wife. A strong federal case is built on documents, but a true collapse is built on paranoia. Criminal partnerships are never based on trust. They are built entirely on mutual greed. If you introduce a single drop of suspicion into that ecosystem, the greed will immediately turn them against each other. Chloe and Julian thought they were a perfect team. They thought they were building an empire together by framing me. But I knew Chloe was planning to abandon him and flee to Switzerland with $4 million of stolen money. Julian was completely oblivious to his wife's impending betrayal. It was time to open his eyes. I opened my encrypted network and accessed the digital files I had pulled from Chloe's personal laptop. I found the high-resolution marketing brochures for the luxury flat she had purchased in Geneva. I sent the files to my secure laser printer. I printed the glossy pages, meticulously recreating the exact promotional materials she had received via email. I placed the documents inside a thick cream-colored envelope. I added a fake return address from a prominent Swiss real estate firm. I checked the internal house cameras. Julian was in his home office pacing the floor and shouting at a vendor over the phone. Chloe was in the master bathroom preparing for a highly expensive spa appointment. The main floor was completely empty. I quietly climbed the wooden stairs and unlocked the heavy basement door. I slipped into the silent hallway and made my way to Chloe's private study. She kept her office locked, but a standard residential deadbolt is absolutely nothing to a man who spent 40 years bypassing federal-grade security systems. I used a tension wrench and a standard pick to open the door in less than 4 seconds. I stepped inside and walked over to her pristine white desk. I opened the bottom drawer where she kept her personal mail. I slid the thick cream-colored envelope all the way to the back, hiding it just enough so it looked concealed but perfectly visible to anyone conducting a frantic search. I locked the door behind me and retreated to the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of tap water and waited. 10 minutes later, Chloe walked out the front door heading to her luxury sport utility vehicle. She was going to spend the afternoon getting a massage funded entirely by my stolen identity. 5 minutes after she left, Julian walked into the kitchen. He looked exhausted. The dark circles under his eyes were growing deeper every single day. The stress of maintaining a massive money laundering syndicate was slowly breaking his physical health. He walked over to the expensive espresso machine and let out a heavy sigh. I shuffled over to the kitchen island, dragging my feet across the imported hardwood floor. I held my glass of water with 2 trembling hands. "Hello, Julian?" I said, my voice sounding frail and highly confused. "I'm sorry to bother you. I was just wondering if Chloe received her mail from yesterday." Julian did not even look at me. He pressed the button on the espresso machine and scoffed. "I do not know, Dad. Why do you care about her mail?" I lowered my head and looked at the floor. "Well, I brought the mail inside yesterday afternoon," I mumbled, playing the part of the helpful but incompetent grandfather. There was a very thick envelope for her. It looked incredibly important. It was from a real estate agency in Geneva. Switzerland, I think. I left it on the entry table, but I could not remember if I told her about it. I just wanted to make sure she did not throw it away by mistake. Julian froze. The loud grinding noise of the espresso machine suddenly sounded deafening in the silent kitchen. He slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes narrowed. "Geneva, Julian," asked, his voice dropping into a tense, harsh register. "Why would Chloe be getting real estate mail from Geneva?" I shrugged my shoulders weakly, pretending to be entirely clueless. "I do not know, Julian," I whispered. The envelope felt very heavy. It had beautiful pictures of mountains on the back. I just thought it was strange. "We do not know anyone in Switzerland, do we?" Julian stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. The seed of paranoia was officially planted. I could practically see the gears grinding inside his head. He was a desperate man facing a massive cash flow crisis. The absolute last thing a desperate criminal wants to hear is that their partner is secretly communicating with international real estate agents in a country famous for hiding stolen money. "Just go back to the basement, Dad," Julian snapped sharply, completely abandoning his coffee. "I will handle the mail." I nodded submissively and shuffled out of the kitchen. I walked down the wooden stairs and locked the heavy steel door behind me. I practically ran to my secure workstation. I threw myself into my leather chair and pulled up the live security feed for the main hallway. I watched Julian march directly toward Chloe's private study. He grabbed the doorknob and rattled it violently. It was locked. He cursed loudly and walked to the kitchen to retrieve the emergency spare key they kept hidden in a ceramic jar. He returned a moment later, shoved the key into the lock, and pushed the door open. Julian was not conducting a casual search. He was a man possessed by sudden, absolute panic. He tore through her office like a wild animal. He yanked open her filing cabinets, throwing folders and loose papers onto the floor. He ripped the cushions off her reading chair. He checked behind her framed diplomas. He was looking for the exit strategy he suddenly realized his wife might be building without him. Then he pulled open the bottom drawer of her desk. I watched his hands stop moving. He reached all the way to the back of the drawer and pulled out the thick cream-colored envelope. He stared at the return address from the Swiss real estate firm. His face turned a sickly shade of pale gray. He ripped the envelope open and pulled out the glossy brochures I had meticulously printed. I zoomed in on the camera feed. Julian was shaking. He was looking at high-resolution photographs of a luxury flat in Geneva. He was reading the property specifications and the incredibly high purchase price. He saw the floor plans meant for a single, wealthy occupant. There was no mention of a husband. There was no mention of a family. Julian crushed the glossy brochures in his fist. He threw them onto the desk and grabbed his hair with both hands. He was hyperventilating. The ultimate betrayal was staring him right in the face. His wife, the woman who had demanded they frame his elderly father, was preparing to abandon him and take the laundered millions with her. He paced back and forth across her office, waiting for her to return. He did not clean up the mess. He wanted her to know exactly what he had found. 2 hours later, the front door opened. Chloe walked into the house carrying a fresh cup of iced coffee, looking completely relaxed and pampered. She walked down the hallway toward her study. When she stepped through the door, she stopped dead in her tracks. Julian was sitting in her desk chair, holding the crushed Swiss real estate brochures. The room was completely destroyed. "What is this, Julian?" he demanded, his voice a terrifying, furious whisper. He kept his voice low because he still believed the frail old man in the basement might hear them. He did not know I was wearing high-definition headphones, listening to every single syllable through the hidden microphones. Chloe dropped her iced coffee. The plastic cup hit the floor and the brown liquid spilled across her expensive rug. She looked at the brochures and the color completely drained from her face. She was a master manipulator caught completely off guard. "Julian, I can explain," Chloe stammered, her voice shaking with genuine panic. "Explain this," Julian hissed, standing up and throwing the crushed papers at her chest. "A luxury flat in Geneva. A property registered entirely in your maiden name. Are you stealing from me, Chloe? Are you taking the money from the holding company and running away? You are going to leave me here to take the fall for the federal tax fraud while you hide in Europe." Chloe backed up against the wall. She was cornered. But highly functioning sociopaths are incredibly dangerous when cornered. Their brains calculate survival strategies at lightning speed. I listened closely, waiting to see how she would attempt to spin this massive, undeniable betrayal. She took a deep breath. She forced herself to stop shaking. She looked Julian directly in the eyes, and she completely changed her posture. She stopped acting like a guilty wife and instantly shifted into the role of a brilliant protective partner. "You are such a fool," Julian, Chloe whispered harshly, stepping toward him. "You think I am abandoning you. You think I am running away. I am trying to save our future." Julian scoffed, stepping back. "Do not lie to me. The documents are in your maiden name." "Of course they are in my maiden name," Chloe countered fiercely, pointing a sharp, manicured finger at his face. "Think about it, Julian. When the Internal Revenue Service finally audits the company, they are going to trace the funds directly to the Shell Corporation. We have the documents perfectly set up to frame your father. But what happens if the federal agents freeze our domestic accounts during the investigation? What happens if they lock down your logistics company while your father goes to trial?" Julian hesitated. The absolute certainty in her voice was making him doubt his own eyes. "I bought that property in Geneva as a blind safe haven for us." Chloe continued, pressing her advantage, completely fabricating a masterful lie on the spot. "I used my maiden name so the asset could never be tied to your corporate tax identification numbers. It is a completely insulated offshore investment. Once your father takes the fall and goes to federal prison, we are going to need a clean place to let the dust settle. I was building us a sanctuary, Julian. It was supposed to be a surprise for you after we survived the audit, and you ruined it by tearing my office apart like a paranoid lunatic." I sat in my basement, slowly clapping my hands together in silent applause. It was an absolutely spectacular performance. Chloe had taken a documented escape plan and completely weaponized it, turning her betrayal into an act of supreme marital devotion. I watched Julian on the monitor. His shoulders dropped. The furious tension completely left his body. He wanted to believe her. He needed to believe her. He was a weak man, relying entirely on stolen money and a fraudulent lifestyle. Facing the reality that his wife was going to leave him destitute and headed for prison was too terrifying to accept. So he chose the comfortable lie. "Chloe, I am sorry," Julian whispered, stepping forward and wrapping his arms around her. "I have just been under so much pressure. The vendors, the taxes, my father living downstairs. It is driving me crazy. I should never have doubted you." Chloe hugged him back, resting her chin on his shoulder. But I saw her face on the high-definition security camera. Her eyes were completely cold. Her jaw was clenched in pure, absolute hatred. She was hugging a man she fully intended to destroy in exactly 6 days. "I forgive you, Julian," she whispered softly, patting his back. "We are a team. We are going to get through this together. We just have to survive Thanksgiving. Then we execute the plan, and your father takes the blame for everything." I took off my headphones and powered down the audio feed. The hallway fell silent. Chloe had managed to talk her way out of the immediate crisis. She had successfully manipulated my son back into compliance. But a massive permanent fracture had been introduced into their criminal partnership. Julian accepted her excuse, but the seed of distrust was fully planted deep inside his mind. He would never look at her the same way again. He would constantly wonder if she was secretly transferring funds. He would check his back every single time she picked up her phone. They were a house divided, operating purely on borrowed time and mutual paranoia. They thought they only had to survive the Thanksgiving holiday. They thought they only had to deal with an annoying, senile old man for a few more days before their problems magically disappeared. They did not know that the old man in the basement had just armed the final explosive charge. The family was arriving. The turkey was being prepared. The stage was perfectly set. They were about to host the most extravagant Thanksgiving dinner of their entire lives, and I was going to serve them a massive plate of absolute unmitigated destruction. Thanksgiving morning arrived with a bitter cold wind sweeping across the sprawling manicured lawns of the $2 million estate. Inside the massive mansion, the air was thick with the suffocating smell of roasted turkey, expensive imported truffles, and the overwhelming stench of stolen wealth. 40 guests were scheduled to arrive by noon. The catering staff moved frantically through the open-concept kitchen carrying silver platters and crystal champagne flutes. Chloe marched around the grand dining room wearing a pristine designer dress purchased with laundered corporate funds. She was aggressively directing the staff, ensuring every single detail was absolutely perfect. Julian paced nervously near the grand entryway, adjusting his custom-tailored silk tie. The massive financial pressure was clearly visible in the dark circles under his bloodshot eyes. He was trying to project the image of a highly successful logistics magnate, but he was silently drowning in massive debt and crippling paranoia. He kept glancing suspiciously at his wife, wondering if she was secretly plotting to board a flight to Geneva and leave him completely destroyed. I remained completely out of their way. I stood very quietly in the dark hallway, wearing a cheap faded sweater and scuffed orthopedic shoes. I was playing my role flawlessly. I let my shoulders slump forward and I maintained a vacant, confused expression on my wrinkled face. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy mahogany front doors swung open and the wealthy guests began pouring into the foyer. They were corporate lawyers, venture capitalists, and private equity directors. They wore expensive cashmere coats and diamond watches. They laughed loudly and handed expensive bottles of wine to the hired staff. The sheer volume of arrogant entitlement filling the room was absolutely nauseating. And then the patriarch of the Vance family had finally arrived. Donovan Vance was a loud, massive man with a bright red face and a head of thinning white hair. He was a ruthless commercial real estate developer from Connecticut who built his entire fortune by bullying local contractors and exploiting zoning loopholes. He possessed a deeply ingrained sense of racial superiority that he barely bothered to hide behind his country club smile. He walked into the foyer like a conquering king, demanding immediate attention from everyone in the room. Chloe rushed forward to hug him, kissing him on both cheeks and taking his expensive leather gloves from his big hands. Julian stepped forward, extending his hand to greet his father-in-law. Donovan ignored Julian completely and looked around the massive foyer with a critical, calculating gaze. He spotted me standing quietly in the shadows near the sweeping staircase. His eyes narrowed in absolute disgust. He did not see a retired federal forensic accountant who could destroy his entire life with a single keystroke. He saw a frail, elderly black man standing in the beautiful home of his daughter. Donovan unbuttoned his heavy tailored wool overcoat and shrugged it off his broad shoulders, letting it drop carelessly from his arms. He did not hand his expensive coat to the uniformed catering staff waiting nearby. He looked directly into my eyes and snapped his thick fingers twice. "Hey, you!" Donovan barked, his voice echoing loudly over the polite chatter of the wealthy guests. "Take this coat and hang it up in the back closet before it gets wrinkled. Make sure you use a proper wooden hanger. Do not just throw it on a chair, old man." The entire foyer fell completely silent. The venture capitalists and corporate lawyers slowly turned their heads to watch the incredibly uncomfortable and highly offensive interaction. Chloe smiled a cold, cruel smile and took a sip of her champagne. Julian looked at the marble floor, completely refusing to defend his own father. He was too weak to stand up to a racist real estate developer who held the keys to his high society acceptance. I did not react with anger. I did not stand tall and demand basic human respect. I simply lowered my head in complete submissive obedience. I stepped forward, forcing a heavy, pronounced limp into my right leg. I dragged my foot across the polished marble floor, making myself look completely physically broken. I reached out with trembling hands and took the heavy wool overcoat from Donovan. "Yes, sir," I whispered, keeping my voice incredibly soft and subservient. "I will take care of it right away." Donovan scoffed loudly, turning his back to me completely. He began speaking to a wealthy investor about a new commercial development project. I turned around and shuffled slowly down the long hallway carrying his expensive coat. I walked toward the back coat closet, dragging my right leg the entire way. I let them all believe they were superior. I let them enjoy their pathetic, racist social power. I hung the heavy wool coat on a wooden hanger just as he commanded. I patted the expensive fabric and smiled in the dark closet. Donovan was an arrogant fool who thought his money gave him the absolute right to humiliate an elderly black man. He did not know that his primary holding company was fully underwritten by the fraudulent logistics firm. He did not know that his own massive bank accounts were currently being targeted by the federal government. He thought he was giving an order to the hired help, but he was actually insulting his silent federal executioner. The catering staff announced that the Thanksgiving feast was finally ready to be served. The 40 wealthy guests migrated into the grand dining room. The massive mahogany table was covered in expensive white linen, tall crystal wine glasses, and elaborate silver centerpieces. Julian took his seat at the head of the table, trying to project total authority. Chloe sat gracefully to his right, and Donovan took the seat of honor to his left. There was no chair reserved for me at the grand table. There was no place setting with my name on it among the wealthy elite party guests. Chloe had specifically instructed the catering staff to set up a small, cheap folding table in the dark hallway just outside the swinging kitchen doors. It was the absolute ultimate insult. I was completely excluded from the family dinner. I was banished to sit alone in the shadows, watching the waiters carry heavy trays of roasted turkey and expensive side dishes past my miserable little corner. I walked over to the flimsy folding chair and sat down quietly. I rested my hands on my lap and looked at the grand dining room through the crack in the open wooden doorway. The noise of the party grew louder as the expensive wine began to flow freely. The guests laughed and clinked their crystal glasses together, celebrating their stolen wealth and their unearned privileges. I sat in the dim light of the hallway eating a small plate of cold food. But my mind was not focused on the humiliating seating arrangement. My mind was focused entirely on the heavy inside pocket of my faded gray cardigan. Resting perfectly against my chest was a thick manila envelope. The paper felt heavy and incredibly powerful. It was the physical manifestation of their absolute destruction. Inside that thick manila envelope were the official federal asset seizure notices. Inside were the printed digital routing logs proving the massive corporate identity theft. Inside were the printed transcripts of Chloe booking her one-way first-class ticket to Geneva. The envelope contained every single piece of absolute, undeniable evidence required to send my son, his wife, and his arrogant father-in-law to a maximum security federal penitentiary. I patted the outside of my cardigan, feeling the solid rectangular shape of the envelope. The weight of it was incredibly comforting. The final federal trap was officially fully armed. I looked at the grandfather clock standing in the corner of the hallway. It was exactly 2 p.m. I knew exactly what was happening just outside the boundaries of this pristine $2 million estate. Sitting quietly in unmarked black utility vans just 3 blocks away was lead prosecutor Derek Thorne and a dozen heavily armed federal agents from the Department of Justice. They were parked in the shadows of the wealthy suburban neighborhood, completely invisible to the arrogant guests drinking champagne inside. They were wearing dark tactical gear and waiting patiently for my final execution strike signal. I took a slow sip of my tap water and watched Donovan raise his glass for a toast in the grand dining room. He was about to give a loud, pompous speech praising his own brilliance and mocking my supposed failures. He was about to demand the attention of the entire room. I sat perfectly still in the shadows, gripping the edge of my small folding table. Let them laugh, let them drink their stolen wine, let them believe they are the untouchable kings of the world. The sun was shining outside, but a massive federal storm had finally arrived. The massive dining room was filled with the overwhelming noise of clinking silver and loud, arrogant laughter. 40 wealthy guests sat around the custom mahogany table, devouring the expensive roasted turkey and drinking wine that cost more than my first car. I sat completely alone at my flimsy folding table in the dark hallway just outside the kitchen doors. I was a ghost in my own sun house, From my pathetic vantage point, I had a perfect view of the entire grand dining room. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over the guests. The caterers moved silently, pouring more champagne into empty glasses. The atmosphere was thick with the suffocating smell of unearned privilege. Julian sat at the head of the table, trying desperately to look like a man who actually belonged there. He wore his tailored suit, like a suit of armor, but I could see the sweat forming on his forehead. The paranoia I had planted was eating him alive from the inside. He kept casting nervous glances at Chloe, wondering if she was secretly plotting to steal his laundered millions and flee to Geneva. Chloe sat next to him wearing a completely fake smile. She played the part of the devoted, loving wife perfectly, but I knew the exact date and time of her escape flight. She was just waiting for the perfect moment to execute her final maneuver, and sitting right next to her was her loud, aggressive father, Donovan. He was drinking heavily, his face turning a dark shade of red. He was a man who believed the world existed entirely to serve his massive ego. The dinner plates were cleared away by the hired staff, and the room grew slightly quieter as the heavy dessert wines were poured. It was time for the main event. Donovan stood up from his chair, pushing it back so hard the wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished marble floor. He picked up his crystal wine glass and tapped it forcefully with a heavy silver spoon. The sharp ringing sound echoed through the massive dining room, demanding absolute immediate silence from every single person in the room. The 40 wealthy guests stopped talking and turned their attention to the real estate patriarch. Donovan puffed out his chest and smiled a wide, predatory smile. He looked around the room, soaking in the attention of the corporate lawyers and venture capitalists. "We have a lot to be thankful for this year." Donovan began, his voice booming with arrogant authority. "We are sitting in a beautiful home surrounded by successful, powerful people. This room is filled with the absolute best and brightest minds in the business world. We are the ones who build the economy. We are the ones who make the hard decisions and reap the rewards. We do not ask for handouts. We take what we want, and we build empires with our own two bare hands." He paused to take a large gulp of his expensive wine. The guests nodded in solemn agreement, completely blinded by their own towering vanity. Donovan turned his head and looked directly at Julian. He raised his glass toward my son. "I want to make a special toast to my son-in-law, Julian, tonight." Donovan declared, his voice echoing down the long hallway where I sat in the shadows. "Julian is a man who understands the value of hard white-collar work. He built a logistics empire from scratch. He pulled himself up by his bootstraps and completely left his incredibly humble beginnings far behind him." Donovan was not finished. He needed to make sure everyone in the room knew exactly how superior he felt. He pointed his heavy finger toward the kitchen doors. He pointed directly toward the dark hallway where I was sitting quietly at my cheap folding table. "Julian is a prime example of overcoming the absolute dead weight of your past." Donovan sneered, his voice dripping with condescension and racist malice. He did not let a lack of pedigree hold him back. He did not let the burden of a broken, poor background stop him from achieving greatness. He married into a good family, and he learned how to operate in our world. I am incredibly proud to call him my family, because he proved he can run with the big dogs instead of staying on the porch with the rest of the neighborhood. The wealthy guests laughed softly, sipping their wine and murmuring their approval. It was a disgusting display of corporate elitism and thinly veiled prejudice. Donovan smiled proudly and sat heavily back down in his chair. Julian did not stand up to defend the neighborhood he grew up in. He did not defend the father who worked 60-hour weeks to put food on his table. Instead, Julian smiled a wide, cowardly smile. He picked up his own glass and stood up to address the crowd. "Thank you, Donovan," Julian said, his voice projecting across the silent dining room. "I truly appreciate those kind words. It has not always been an easy journey. Sometimes the hardest part of achieving real success is dealing with the anchors that try to drag you down. We all know the extreme burden of taking care of elderly parents who contribute absolutely nothing to society but expect everything in return." Julian looked directly at the kitchen doors, making sure every single guest knew exactly who he was talking about. "It is a massive financial and emotional drain to house someone who refuses to pull their own weight," Julian continued, his voice laced with passive-aggressive venom. "But Chloe and I are good people. We do what is right even when it costs us our peace of mind. We endure the hardship because we are strong and successful. So here is to success, to wealth, and to leaving the dead weight behind us." Julian raised his glass high in the air. The 40 wealthy guests raised their glasses in unison. They laughed out loud, a cruel collective sound that bounced off the high vaulted ceilings of the mansion. They were laughing at the poor old black man sitting in the dark. They were celebrating their absolute dominance over a frail, helpless victim. I sat at my flimsy folding table and did not move a single muscle. I did not frown. I did not show any anger. I slowly picked up my simple glass of tap water and took a quiet, measured sip. I looked at the heavy grandfather clock standing in the corner of the hallway. The brass pendulum swung back and forth with a steady rhythmic tick. It was exactly 2:15 in the afternoon. Let them laugh. Let them bask in the warm glow of their stolen money and their fake superiority. Every single second that ticked by on that clock brought them one step closer to complete total and undeniable destruction. The trap was locked, and the timer was actively counting down. I felt the thick manila envelope resting heavily inside the inner pocket of my faded cardigan. The federal seizure notices were ready. The laughter in the dining room eventually died down, and the guests returned to their expensive desserts and shallow conversations. Julian sat back down, feeling incredibly proud of his cowardly speech. He thought he had just proven his ultimate worth to his racist father-in-law. He thought he had completely solidified his place among the wealthy elite. He had absolutely no idea that he had just publicly celebrated a logistics empire that was already completely bankrupt. He did not know that his corporate ledgers were currently sitting on a federal prosecutor desk in Washington. I shifted my gaze away from Julian and looked directly at Chloe. She was sipping her champagne, but her eyes were darting nervously around the room. She was not enjoying the party. She was mentally calculating her next exact move. The massive, extravagant Thanksgiving dinner was slowly coming to an absolute end, and she knew her tiny window of opportunity was closing incredibly rapidly. She had her one-way first-class ticket to Geneva booked for Monday morning. She had $4 million of stolen cash locked in an offshore account that she believed was perfectly secure. But before she could safely board that flight to Switzerland, she desperately needed to officially document my supposed insanity on a public federal legal record. The fabricated video of the gas stove was a very good start, but she really needed an active emergency response. She needed a local police presence right here at the mansion today, right in front of 40 wealthy witnesses to legally establish that I was a dangerous criminal element. She needed to frame me for a major, unforgivable crime so she could perfectly justify leaving her own husband and immediately fleeing the country. I watched her slowly stand up from the massive dinner table. It was finally time for her last, final, terrible, tactical move. The heavy dessert wine had finished flowing, and the 40 wealthy guests were growing restless in their heavy wooden chairs. The massive dining room felt suffocating and incredibly warm. Julian stood up and suggested that everyone migrate out to the sweeping stone patio to enjoy the crisp autumn air and smoke their expensive imported cigars. The corporate lawyers and the arrogant real estate developers eagerly agreed. They pushed their chairs back and filed out through the massive glass double doors, leaving the grand dining room completely empty. The catering staff quietly disappeared into the back corridors to begin washing the expensive crystal and silver. I did not follow the wealthy elite out onto the stone patio. I remained sitting perfectly still at my cheap, flimsy folding table in the dark hallway just outside the kitchen doors. I was the invisible old man, the pathetic charity case they had already forgotten about. I watched them through the glass doors, laughing and blowing thick clouds of gray smoke into the cold November sky. Chloe did not stay on the patio for very long. She mingled for exactly 5 minutes, flashing her fake smile and holding her empty champagne flute. Then she quietly slipped back inside the mansion. She walked right past my dark corner without even looking in my direction. She climbed the sweeping grand staircase, heading straight toward her luxurious master bedroom on the second floor. I knew exactly what she was going to do. She was initiating the final devastating phase of her master escape plan. She needed a highly dramatic local police incident today to legally document my supposed criminal insanity before her scheduled flight to Geneva on Monday morning. I sat in the shadows and waited for the theatrical performance to begin. I took a slow, calm breath and let the heavy silence of the empty house settle around me. It took exactly 4 minutes for the absolute chaos to erupt. The sudden piercing sound of a woman screaming violently shattered the quiet peace of the sprawling $2 million estate. It was not a genuine scream of terror. It was a highly calculated, perfectly executed shriek of absolute artificial panic. The sound echoed down the long wooden staircase and bounced off the high vaulted ceilings of the foyer. The guests out on the stone patio immediately stopped laughing. The classical piano music playing softly through the hidden ceiling speakers suddenly seemed incredibly loud and out of place. Julian dropped his expensive cigar onto the stone pavers and rushed back inside the house, followed closely by Donovan and the rest of the wealthy elite. They crowded into the grand foyer, looking up toward the second floor with wide, fearful expressions. Then Chloe appeared at the top of the sweeping staircase. She was putting on the absolute performance of a lifetime. Her pristine designer dress was slightly rumpled. Her hair was perfectly messed up to convey sudden distress. She was sobbing loudly, covering her face with her manicured hands and taking deep, ragged breaths. She practically threw herself down the carpeted stairs, stumbling intentionally to make her panic look completely authentic. She reached the bottom step and collapsed into Julian's arms, weeping hysterically into his tailored suit jacket. The 40 wealthy guests gasped in collective horror, completely captivated by the dramatic spectacle unfolding right in front of them. Julian held his wife tightly, looking around the room in absolute confusion, asking her over and over again what had happened. Chloe pulled her face away from his chest. Her eyes were wide and filled with perfectly simulated tears. She pointed a shaking finger toward the second floor and let out another loud, dramatic sob. "It is gone," Chloe cried, her voice echoing loudly across the marble floor of the grand foyer. "My grandmother diamond necklace is completely gone. I went upstairs to put it on for the family photographs, and the velvet box on my vanity is completely empty. The necklace is worth $100,000, Julian, and someone in this house stole it." The entire room erupted into frantic, shocked whispers. A $100,000 diamond heirloom vanishing in the middle of a high society Thanksgiving party was an absolute scandal. Donovan pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his face turning a violent shade of dark red. He demanded to know how a priceless piece of jewelry could just disappear from a secure master bedroom. Julian tried to calm his wife down, telling her that she must have just misplaced it in her rush to get ready for the party. But Chloe violently shook her head, refusing to accept that logical explanation. She pulled away from Julian and turned her body completely around. She looked past the grand dining room and stared directly into the dark hallway where I was sitting quietly at my cheap folding table. The entire crowd of wealthy guests followed her gaze. 40 pairs of angry, suspicious eyes locked onto the frail, elderly black man sitting alone in the shadows. Chloe raised her right arm and pointed her shaking, manicured finger directly at my chest. "He is the only one," she screamed, her voice dripping with absolute venom and fake betrayal. "He is the only person who stayed behind inside the house when we all went out to the stone patio. He was left completely alone with access to the upstairs bedrooms. He has been stealing money from our checking accounts for months, Julian. He is a dangerous criminal, and he took my grandmother's necklace." The heavy silence that followed her accusation was completely suffocating. The venture capitalists and corporate lawyers stared at me with absolute sheer disgust. They had just listened to Julian and Donovan mock my poor background, and now they firmly believed they were looking at a common thief. Julian's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The paranoia that had been eating him alive all day suddenly found a convenient and helpless target. He completely forgot about the massive corporate debt. He completely forgot about the fake Swiss real estate brochures he had found in her office. He only saw the frail old man sitting at the folding table, making him look like an absolute fool in front of his wealthy, powerful father-in-law. Julian marched across the dining room, his heavy leather shoes stomping aggressively against the polished hardwood floors. He crossed the threshold into the dark hallway and lunged directly at me. He did not ask me if I took the necklace. He did not ask for my side of the story. He reached out with both of his large hands and grabbed the front collar of my faded gray cardigan. He hauled me violently out of my flimsy folding chair, pulling me up to my feet with terrifying, aggressive force. I let my body go completely limp, offering absolutely no physical resistance. I allowed him to drag me out of the dark hallway and into the bright, harsh light of the grand dining room right in front of the 40 staring guests. He shoved me roughly, forcing me to stumble backward and catch my balance against the heavy mahogany dinner table. "You disgusting old thief!" Julian roared, his voice cracking with absolute uncontrollable fury. You steal my food, you live in my basement for free, and now you rob my wife on Thanksgiving Day. Where is the necklace? Tell me where you hid the necklace right now before I break your jaw." I stood there leaning against the expensive wooden table, keeping my shoulders hunched entirely forward. I forced my hands to shake violently, resting them against my chest. I looked at Julian with wide, terrified eyes, letting a pathetic, confused whine escape my throat. "I do not know what you are talking about, Julian," I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly weak and frail. "I have been sitting right here the entire time. I never went upstairs. I promise you I did not take anything from her room." Julian raised his fist, stepping forward to physically strike his own father in front of a crowd of cheering wealthy elites. But before he could throw the punch, Donovan stepped heavily into the dining room. The massive, racist real estate developer pushed Julian aside, taking complete control of the situation. Donovan looked at me with absolute supreme hatred. His face was a dark, violent purple. He turned to his daughter and his son-in-law and delivered the exact command that Chloe had been desperately waiting to hear. "Do not hit him, Julian." Donovan barked, his voice echoing with total arrogant authority. "If you hit him, you will just give this criminal element an excuse to sue you. We are not going to handle this like street thugs. We are going to handle this the right way. Call the local police immediately, call the authorities, and tell them we have a confirmed felony grand larceny in progress. Send your best officers right now, because we are not letting this dangerous man escape the premises with our valuable family property tonight, under any circumstances whatsoever." Donovan shouted with extreme, undeniable, hostile conviction, pacing back and forth. The air in the grand dining room grew incredibly heavy and entirely toxic. 40 wealthy guests formed a tight, suffocating circle around me. They were corporate lawyers, venture capitalists, and aggressive real estate developers. They all wore expensive, tailored suits and heavy diamond jewelry bought with trust funds and corporate bonuses. And right in the center of their absolute arrogant judgment stood a 73-year-old black man, wearing a faded gray cardigan and scuffed orthopedic shoes. I kept my head bowed and my shoulders hunched forward, playing the role of the terrified, cornered animal to absolute perfection today. Donovan stood a few feet away with his arms crossed over his massive chest, his face dark red with racist fury. He had just demanded that Julian call the local police to have me arrested for felony grand larceny. The sheer hostility radiating from the crowd was a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. They wanted to see me destroyed. They wanted to see the poor old man punished for daring to breathe the same expensive air as them. Julian stood right in front of me, his fists clenched tight at his sides, completely trapped in his blind rage. Julian was breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically between me and his weeping wife. He was completely trapped in the terrifying web of her manipulation. But his massive ego demanded that he take absolute control of the situation. He needed to prove to his wealthy father-in-law that he was a strong, ruthless man capable of protecting his $2 million mansion. Chloe stepped forward, wiping fake tears from her eyes. She pointed her shaking, manicured finger past me toward the dark hallway. She pointed directly at my worn leather duffel bag resting beside my cheap folding chair today. He was planning to leave. Chloe screamed, her voice echoing loudly through the silent dining room. He packed his bag this morning. I saw him stuffing his clothes into that disgusting old leather duffel bag. He knew we were having a party, and he knew we would all be distracted. He stole my grandmother $100,000 diamond necklace, and he is trying to sneak out the back door right now. Search his bag, Julian. Search his bag right in front of everyone and prove to the entire family that your father is nothing but a common violent criminal. The crowd of 40 wealthy guests gasped loudly, shifting their hostile gaze toward my old worn leather bag. The duffel bag contained a few cheap shirts and my reading glasses. But I knew exactly what else was inside it right now. Chloe had quietly slipped away from the stone patio exactly 20 minutes ago. She had walked past my dark corner without looking at me, and she had deliberately planted the expensive diamond necklace deep inside my personal belongings. She needed physical, undeniable evidence of a felony to justify calling the local police and officially documenting my supposed criminal insanity. Julian marched past me, his heavy leather shoes stomping aggressively against the polished hardwood floors. He walked into the dark hallway and snatched my worn leather duffel bag from the floor. He carried it back into the bright, harsh light of the grand dining room and dropped it heavily onto the expensive mahogany dining table right next to the remnants of the roasted turkey. "Open it, Julian!" Donovan barked, his voice laced with supreme racist arrogance. "Tear that cheap bag apart and let us see exactly what this pathetic old man is trying to steal from my beautiful, successful daughter." I did not offer any physical resistance. I did not scream or beg for mercy. I simply stood there, leaning heavily against the edge of the dining table, keeping my hands trembling violently against my chest. I let my lower lip quiver, simulating complete and absolute terror. "Please, Julian," I whispered, making my voice sound incredibly weak and frail. "Please do not go through my personal things. I do not have anything valuable in there. I am just a poor old man. I promise you I did not take anything that belongs to your wife or your powerful, wealthy family." My simulated begging only fueled their massive, towering arrogance. Chloe pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her eyes burning with a cruel, victorious light. She reached out and grabbed the heavy brass zipper of my leather duffel bag. She yanked the zipper open with aggressive, violent force. She plunged her hands deep into my folded clothes, tossing my cheap faded shirts and my worn cotton socks carelessly onto the polished mahogany table. She rummaged through the bag with frantic theatrical energy, making absolutely sure every single wealthy guest in the room was watching her desperate fake search. And then she stopped moving. She let out a loud, dramatic gasp that echoed perfectly off the high vaulted ceilings of the mansion. She slowly pulled her hand out of the deep pockets of my leather bag. Dangling from her manicured fingers, catching the warm golden light of the crystal chandeliers, was a massive, glittering diamond necklace. The heavy precious stones sparkled brilliantly against the stark contrast of my cheap, scattered clothing. The entire room erupted into a collective horrifying gasp. The venture capitalists and corporate lawyers covered their mouths, whispering frantically about the absolute scandal unfolding before their eyes. "I knew it!" Chloe sobbed loudly, clutching the expensive diamond necklace to her chest as if she had just rescued a drowning child. "I knew he took it, Julian. Look at what your father did to us. After everything we have done for him, after we let him live in our beautiful home and eat our expensive food. He repays our kindness by stealing my most precious family heirloom. He is a monster, Julian. He is a completely dangerous, sick old man, and we need to get him out of this house before he tries to physically hurt us today." Julian stared at the diamond necklace resting in his wife's hands. The final lingering shred of his human decency completely evaporated. He looked at me with eyes completely devoid of any familial love or basic respect. He saw me not as a father, but as a disgusting parasite that threatened his fake high society lifestyle. He marched forward, closing the distance between us until we were standing mere inches apart. He leaned his face incredibly close to mine, his breath smelling strongly of expensive bourbon and deep, uncontrollable rage. He looked me directly in the eyes with absolute total disgust. "You disgusting old thief," Julian hissed, his voice dropping to a lethal, furious whisper. "You are an absolute embarrassment to my entire existence. I am so incredibly ashamed that I share the same blood as you. You are nothing but a broken, pathetic criminal, and I am entirely finished taking care of you." Julian stepped back and did the most incredibly disrespectful thing a son could ever do to the father who raised him. He gathered the saliva in his mouth, and he spat violently right at my scuffed orthopedic shoes. The spit landed heavily on the polished hardwood floor. The wealthy crowd murmured in shock, but Donovan smiled a wide, satisfied smile. "That is right, Julian." Donovan cheered loudly, crossing his massive arms. "Show this criminal element exactly where he belongs. Do not show him any mercy. Call the cops right now and let them drag him away in heavy steel handcuffs." Julian reached into the pocket of his tailored suit and pulled out his expensive smartphone. He unlocked the screen and held it up for the entire room to see. "I am calling the cops right now," Julian announced, his voice booming with absolute cold mechanical authority today. I stood perfectly still and looked down at the spit resting on the hardwood floor near my shoes. For 6 entire months, I had played the role of the frail, terrified, elderly black man. I had endured their racist insults, their emotional abuse, and their incredibly arrogant condescension. I had let them steal my identity and drain my small pension account. I had let them shove me into a damp, dark basement. But the moment my son spat at my feet, the elaborate theatrical performance officially ended. The pathetic, helpless old grandfather completely died right there in the dining room. I finally stood up. The hunched shoulders instantly straightened, pulling my spine perfectly erect. The frail, violent tremor in my hands completely vanished. I rolled my shoulders back, expanding my chest, and suddenly I appeared physically larger and incredibly dangerous. I looked directly at Julian with eyes completely dead of any fatherly affection. He paused, his thumb hovering over the phone screen, suddenly terrified by my sudden physical transformation. "Call them," I said, my natural baritone voice booming like thunder through the absolutely silent dining room, conveying total lethal power. "They are already waiting outside right now for you, Julian." The entire dining room froze in absolute stunned silence. The sudden physical transformation was completely undeniable. I was no longer the frail, trembling grandfather shuffling around the dark basement. I stood perfectly straight, expanding my broad chest and looking down at the man who used to be my son. Julian stood frozen with his expensive smartphone gripped tightly in his sweating hand. His thumb hovered directly over the screen, but he could not press the buttons. He stared at my eyes, and he saw absolutely zero fear. He only saw cold, mechanical calculation. The 40 wealthy guests who had just spent the entire afternoon laughing at me suddenly took a collective step backward. The venture capitalists and the corporate lawyers instinctively recognized the terrifying shift in the atmosphere. The prey had just revealed himself to be the apex predator, and the absolute panic began to spread through the room like a rapid virus. Chloe completely stopped her dramatic fake sobbing. Her manicured hands dropped slowly to her sides. She stared at my face, and the brilliant illusion she had so meticulously crafted began to shatter into a million tiny pieces. Donovan lowered his massive arms, his dark red face turning a sickly shade of pale gray. He opened his mouth to shout another arrogant command, but the words completely died in his throat. The sheer physical authority radiating from my posture forced the entire room into total submission. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. The heavy leather soles of my scuffed orthopedic shoes cracked loudly against the polished hardwood floor. The sound echoed through the high, vaulted ceilings of the mansion, sounding exactly like a heavy gavel striking a wooden block inside a federal courtroom. "You wanted to expose a thief today, Julian," I said, my voice dropping into a low, resonant baritone that commanded absolute, unwavering attention. I spoke clearly and methodically, making absolutely sure every single wealthy elite in the room heard every single syllable. "Since we are exposing thieves today, let us open our Thanksgiving gifts." I reached inside the deep inner pocket of my faded gray cardigan. I moved my hands with precise, calculated speed. I pulled out the thick, heavy manila envelope that I had been carrying all afternoon. The thick paper felt incredibly solid in my hands. It was the physical manifestation of 40 years of federal investigative experience. It was the absolute, undeniable destruction of their entire fraudulent criminal empire. Julian stared at the thick envelope. His eyes darted nervously between the manila paper and my cold, dead expression. "What is that?" Julian stammered, his voice cracking with sudden, uncontrolled terror. "What are you doing, old man?" I did not answer his pathetic question. I gripped the top edge of the thick manila envelope and I tore it open. The loud, sharp sound of the heavy, thick manila paper ripping violently apart sliced through the silent dining room like a razor blade. The 40 guests held their breath, completely captivated by the dramatic unmasking of the old man they thought was a helpless victim. I pulled out a massive stack of crisp white legal documents. They were printed on heavy watermarked bond paper featuring the distinct, highly intimidating seals of the United States Department of Justice and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. I walked past Julian, completely ignoring his trembling presence. I marched directly toward the expensive mahogany dining table where the remnants of their lavish Thanksgiving feast still sat. I stopped right in front of Donovan, the loud, racist real estate developer who had demanded I hang up his heavy wool coat just a few hours ago. I looked directly into his arrogant eyes and I smiled a cold, lethal smile. I lifted the first thick document from the stack and I dropped it heavily onto the polished wood right next to his crystal wine glass. The heavy paper landed with a loud, satisfying smack. Donovan looked down at the document. His eyes scanned the bold black text printed across the top of the page. The warm blood completely and rapidly drained from his massive face in pure terror. Julian rushed forward, standing next to his terrified father-in-law. Julian looked down at the crisp white paper resting on his expensive dining table. He saw the bright red federal stamps. He saw his own logistics company name printed in bold capital letters. He saw the official signatures of federal judges authorizing massive absolute action. His breathing became incredibly shallow and rapid. He reached out with a shaking hand hovering over the document, but he was too absolutely terrified to physically touch the paper. "That is an official federal asset seizure notice," I announced, my voice booming like thunder across the completely silent room. "Julian, your logistics company is entirely bankrupt. You have absolutely zero liquid capital left in your corporate operating accounts. You owe the Internal Revenue Service exactly $3 million in laundered corporate taxes. And you stupidly used my personal social security number to execute your entire pathetic amateur fraud." The entire room erupted into frantic, horrified whispers. The corporate lawyers in the crowd instantly recognized the specific legal formatting of the federal seizure notice. They knew exactly what those red stamps meant. They began backing away toward the front doors, desperately trying to physically distance themselves from a highly toxic, active federal crime scene. Julian staggered backward, clutching his chest as if he had just been physically shot. The illusion of his massive wealth and his logistics empire was completely actively disintegrating in front of his wealthy peers. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, desperately searching for any trace of the helpless, loving father he thought he had dominated. "You set me up," Julian gasped, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You are a retired government clerk. You do not have the power to do this. This is a fake document. You forged this to ruin my life." I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I looked down at my son, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical detachment. "You thought I was a broke retired clerk, Julian," I said, keeping my tone flat and devoid of any sympathy. "You thought I survived on a $1,200 pension. You moved me into your damp basement, and you stole my identity because you thought I was too stupid and too old to understand modern financial architecture. You thought you were a brilliant criminal mastermind building an untouchable empire." I pointed a steady finger directly at his sweating face. "You are not a mastermind, Julian," I stated coldly. "You are a sloppy, greedy little boy who left a massive digital blood trail across the entire internet. You thought you invited a helpless victim into your home? You had absolutely no idea that you invited a senior forensic accountant for the federal bankruptcy courts directly into your private network. I spent 40 years hunting down international money launderers and corporate terrorists. I wrote the exact decryption algorithms that the federal government uses to track hidden offshore money. You thought you could hide your stolen millions from me, Julian. I reverse-engineered your corporate structure in less than 45 minutes, while sitting in the dark basement you threw me into." Julian's knees buckled completely. He reached out and grabbed the back of an expensive dining chair just to keep himself from collapsing onto the hardwood floor. He finally realized the absolute terrifying magnitude of his catastrophic mistake. He had not just stolen from a helpless old man. He had stolen from an apex predator who had systematically mapped every single digital footprint he had ever made. He looked at the federal asset seizure notice resting on the mahogany table, and he knew his life was completely permanently over. Chloe backed away toward the kitchen doors, her face a mask of panic. She realized her master escape plan was in jeopardy. She had planned to trigger the federal raid herself on her own timeline. She had planned to be sitting in a luxury flat in Geneva, Switzerland when the federal agents arrived. She did not understand how the timeline had accelerated so violently. She did not understand how the old man she had tortured and humiliated was currently orchestrating the absolute destruction of her world. "You cannot do this to me," Julian cried, tears of terror spilling down his face. "I am your son. You are my father. You are supposed to protect me." I looked at him and felt nothing. I remembered the damp basement. I remembered the stolen $4,000. I remembered his threat to take my grandson Leo away forever. "You stopped being my son the exact moment you decided to use my name to build your fraudulent empire," I replied, my voice echoing coldly. "You decided to sacrifice my freedom to buy your expensive mansion. You wanted to play a high-stakes federal game, Julian, and now you pay the absolute price." Julian stood completely paralyzed next to the expensive mahogany table. His face lost every single drop of color, turning the pale, sickening shade of crushed chalk. The absolute reality of his federal destruction was finally crushing his massive, unearned ego. He was a fraud who had just been completely exposed in front of the exact wealthy elites he was so incredibly desperate to impress. But while Julian was mentally and physically shutting down under the immense weight of the federal asset seizure notice, his wife was operating on pure desperate instinct. Chloe was a highly functioning sociopath, and sociopaths do not surrender when they are cornered. They lash out with violent, unpredictable force. She realized her entire master escape plan was actively burning to the ground right in front of her eyes. She lunged forward across the dining room. Her expensive designer heels cracked sharply against the polished hardwood floor. She reached out with both of her manicured hands, desperately trying to snatch the crisp white federal documents resting on the table. She wanted to rip the heavy bond paper into tiny little pieces and destroy the undeniable proof of her massive financial crimes. I did not flinch or step back. I anticipated her desperate physical response because criminals always resort to the exact same pathetic tactics when their digital fortresses collapse. As her fingers brushed the top edge of the federal seizure notice, I moved with the rapid, calculated speed of a man who spent decades surviving highly hostile environments. I slammed my large, heavy right hand down onto the mahogany table. I trapped her delicate, manicured fingers flat against the solid wood directly underneath my palm. The loud, violent smack of my hand hitting the table echoed like a gunshot through the completely silent dining room. Chloe let out a sudden, sharp gasp of pain and tried to yank her hand away, but my grip was absolute and entirely unyielding. I pinned her hand to the table, pressing her fingers firmly into the official federal paperwork she had just tried to destroy. The 40 wealthy guests gasped again, stepping even further back toward the foyer. I looked directly into her wide, terrified eyes. I spent 40 years working as a senior forensic accountant for the federal bankruptcy courts, Chloe. I said, my voice dropping into a cold, mechanical, and entirely lethal register. I spoke clearly, making sure every single syllable landed with absolute devastating precision. You thought you could frame a 73-year-old man using a fake limited liability shell company. You thought you could steal my social security number and hide $3 million of laundered corporate revenue in a dark account because you assumed I was just a broke retired government clerk. You thought your pathetic amateur financial architecture was completely invisible. You had absolutely no idea who you threw into that damp, cold basement. I leaned forward slightly, keeping her hand firmly pinned to the table. I reverse-engineered your entire fraudulent corporate structure in less than 45 minutes on the very first night I moved into this house. I continued, my voice echoing across the room. You invited the absolute ultimate predator directly into your private network. You gave me complete administrative access to every single server you own. I watched you steal from the federal government. I watched you steal from my checking account, and I systematically logged every single keystroke you made. I have every single internet protocol address you ever used to route your dirty money. I have the digital metadata for every single forged signature you placed on those fraudulent corporate ledgers. You left a massive glowing digital blood trail, and I collected every single drop of it. Chloe stared at me, her jaw trembling uncontrollably. The arrogant superior woman who had sprayed air freshener at me and demanded $800 in rent was completely, entirely dead. She was looking at a federal ghost who had systematically dismantled her entire existence while pretending to be a frail, confused, old grandfather. But I was not finished breaking her mind. I needed to completely eradicate the fake medical narrative she had so meticulously constructed to guarantee her safe flight to Switzerland. You thought you were incredibly brilliant when you decided to build a fake medical case against me, I said, tightening my grip on her trapped hand just enough to let her feel my physical authority. You hid my blood pressure medication, and you intentionally turned the gas stove on while the housekeeper was vacuuming the dining room. You pulled out your expensive smartphone and you recorded me acting like a confused, senile old man. You thought you were creating the perfect video evidence to have me permanently committed to a psychiatric ward so you could flee to Geneva with your stolen money. I smiled, a dark, completely unforgiving smile. What you did not know, Chloe, is that I tapped into the internal security cameras wired throughout this massive mansion 6 months ago. I have the high-definition footage of you walking up to that stove and deliberately turning the gas dials. I have the time-stamped video of you willfully endangering every single life in this house just to frame an elderly man. Your fabricated smartphone video is nothing more than a pathetic theatrical performance. My security footage is absolute, undeniable legal proof of criminal conspiracy, reckless endangerment, and felony elder abuse. I sent all of those high-definition video files directly to the United States Department of Justice servers 3 days ago. They have everything, Chloe. Your entire master escape plan is completely dead. I finally released her hand and stepped back. Chloe stumbled backward, clutching her bruised fingers to her chest, sobbing in absolute genuine terror. She finally understood that she was never going to board that first-class flight to Geneva. She was going straight to a federal penitentiary. The entire crowd of wealthy guests remained completely paralyzed by the sheer terrifying magnitude of the revelations. But in every crowd of arrogant elites, there is always one man whose towering ego simply refuses to accept total defeat. Donovan Vance, the loud racist real estate developer, pushed his way through the stunned crowd of corporate lawyers. His thick face was sweating profusely, and his hands were balled into tight, aggressive fists. He marched up to the mahogany dining table and pointed a thick, shaking finger directly at my chest. He completely refused to believe that an elderly black man was currently dismantling his daughter and his son-in-law with such clinical, flawless precision. "You are completely bluffing," Donovan yelled, his voice booming with desperate, artificial authority. "This is an absolute outrage and a complete lie. You are just a bitter old man trying to ruin a beautiful Thanksgiving party with fake documents and ridiculous stories about federal courts. My daughter and my son-in-law are successful, hard-working business owners. They do not launder money, and they do not steal. You printed that fake federal notice in your basement to scare them. I am going to call my personal legal team right now, and I am going to make absolutely sure you are locked in a padded cell for the rest of your miserable, pathetic life." I looked at Donovan and felt a deep, satisfying sense of absolute closure. He was the loud, arrogant architect of his daughter's supreme entitlement. He thought his money and his real estate empire made him completely untouchable. He thought he could stand in my face and demand my absolute submission. I did not raise my voice to match his screaming. I simply reached back into the thick manila envelope resting in my left hand. I pulled out a second, crisp, white legal document. This one was covered in bright red priority markers and official federal banking seals. I held it up for a brief second, letting him clearly see the heavy government stamps before I dropped it onto the dining table right next to the first asset seizure notice. "You do not have a personal legal team anymore, Donovan," I announced, my voice echoing coldly through the grand dining room. "You should check your phone right now. When your son-in-law decided to build his fraudulent logistics company, he needed a massive influx of clean capital to open his corporate accounts. He used your primary real estate holding company as his sole financial underwriter. You legally tied your entire corporate empire directly to his money laundering syndicate." Donovan stared at the paper and his breathing stopped. As of exactly 3:00 this afternoon, the United States Department of Justice officially executed a catastrophic asset freeze protocol on every single account registered to your name, I stated with absolute finality. "Your domestic banks, your offshore trusts, and your corporate routing nodes are completely locked. You have zero liquidity. You are currently under federal investigation for massive conspiracy to commit wire fraud. You are now entirely bankrupt, Donovan." Donovan stared at the federal banking seals printed on the crisp white paper resting on the mahogany table. The loud, arrogant real estate developer was completely destroyed. He pulled his expensive smartphone from his tailored suit with trembling hands. He opened his banking application and stared at the glowing screen. The bright red error messages flashed instantly. Every single corporate account, every offshore trust, and every domestic investment portfolio displayed a zero balance. His entire financial empire had been completely seized by the government because he blindly underwrote his son-in-law. Donovan dropped his phone onto the hardwood floor. He collapsed heavily into a wooden dining chair, gasping for air and clutching his chest in absolute terror. The complete destruction of Donovan Vance sent a massive shockwave of pure panic through the 40 wealthy guests standing in the grand dining room. The venture capitalists and corporate lawyers realized they were standing inside an active federal crime scene. They began scrambling backward toward the grand foyer, pushing past each other in a desperate attempt to escape before the federal agents arrived. But Julian did not try to run. My son was physically paralyzed. He stood next to the dining table, hyperventilating loudly. His face was a mask of pure desperation. The illusion of his successful logistics company was completely dead. The reality of a 15-year federal prison sentence was crashing down onto his massive ego. Julian looked at the federal asset seizure notices, and his brain simply could not process his total, utter failure. He turned his panicked eyes toward me. The arrogant, cruel man who had just violently spat on my shoes suddenly reverted into a terrified, pathetic little boy. His entire body shook uncontrollably as the adrenaline completely abandoned his system, leaving him weak and entirely exposed. "Dad, please," Julian begged, his voice cracking into a frantic whine. "We can fix this. We can hire lawyers and we can explain everything to the federal prosecutors. We can give the money back. I am your son, Dad. You cannot send me to a maximum security federal penitentiary. I will not survive in there. You have to help me fix this right now. Please tell them it was a mistake." He reached out with trembling hands, trying to grab my faded cardigan, but was too terrified to touch me. I did not step back. I looked at my son and felt absolutely nothing but pity. He was a weak coward who had built his adult life on lies and stolen money. He had willingly sacrificed his own father to buy an expensive mansion and impress his father-in-law. When Julian realized I was not going to offer him a single ounce of mercy, he turned his frantic, desperate gaze toward his wife. Chloe was standing near the kitchen doors, her face completely drained of color. Her manicured hands were shaking violently at her sides. "Chloe, please tell him," Julian pleaded, his voice echoing across the chaotic dining room. "Tell him we did not mean to hurt him. Tell him we will give the money back and make everything right. We are a team, Chloe. Tell him we can fix this together right now." Chloe did not say a single word. She stared at Julian with wide, terrified eyes, but she did not offer him any comfort or support. She looked exactly like a cornered animal calculating her final escape route. I looked at Julian, and then I looked at Chloe. The time had finally arrived to completely sever their toxic criminal partnership. I took a slow, deliberate breath and let my natural baritone voice slice through the frantic noise of the dining room. "Tell him exactly what, Chloe," I asked, my voice dropping into a cold, mechanical, and entirely lethal register. "Tell him about the highly secure, private offshore trust account you secretly opened in the Cayman Islands. Tell him how you registered the account entirely under your maiden name so your husband would have absolutely zero legal access to the funds." Julian completely froze. His frantic hyperventilating suddenly stopped. He slowly turned his head away from his wife and looked back at me. His blue eyes widened in pure, unadulterated shock. "What are you talking about?" Julian whispered, his voice barely audible over the panicked whispers of the wealthy guests. "What Cayman Island account?" I kept my eyes locked directly on Chloe, watching the final remaining pieces of her flawless mask shatter completely into dust. "Tell him about the $4 million you secretly siphoned out of his fraudulent shell company." "Chloe," I continued, my voice booming with undeniable federal authority, "tell him how you altered the digital routing instructions on the back end of the Curtis Holdings ledgers. Every time your husband authorized a transfer to clean the stolen money, you intercepted a massive percentage of the funds and bled his company dry right under his nose." Julian's mouth dropped open. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a dead man standing upright. He remembered the massive gaping holes in his corporate balance sheets. He remembered the desperate cash flow crisis eating him alive for 3 months. He had blamed the economy. He had no idea his beautiful, devoted wife had been systematically robbing him blind every single day. "Tell him about the glossy real estate brochures for the luxury flat in Geneva, Switzerland," I said, stepping closer to the dining table. "Tell him how you lied to his face when he found the documents I planted in your desk. You told him the luxury flat was a blind, safe haven for your future together. You told him it was a brilliant investment to protect your family." I reached into the thick manila envelope and pulled out the final crisp, white document. I held it up for Julian to see clearly. It was a printed, digital confirmation of an international flight itinerary. But that was a complete lie, Julian. I announced, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "She never planned to take you to Switzerland. Look at this digital flight confirmation. She used the stolen money in the Cayman Island account to book a one-way, first-class ticket from Atlanta directly to Geneva. The departure date is December 1st. That is exactly 4 days from right now, Julian. There is only one single passenger ticket booked. There is no ticket for you. There is no ticket for your son, Leo. She was absolutely going to leave you entirely behind." Julian stared at the printed flight confirmation in my steady hand. The sheer brutal magnitude of her betrayal crashed down onto his fragile mind. His brain completely broke in that exact moment. "Tell him the rest of your brilliant master plan, Chloe," I said, delivering the final devastating blow. "Tell him how you planned to anonymously call the Internal Revenue Service the exact moment your flight landed in Geneva. Tell him how you planned to hand the federal agents the exact location of his fraudulent corporate ledgers. She was leaving you to take the full fall for the IRS, Julian." She engineered this entire situation so you and I would go to federal prison for decades while she lived a luxurious life in Switzerland with $4 million of stolen cash. The silence in the dining room was completely suffocating. The wealthy guests stopped scrambling toward the front doors and turned around to watch the horrifying destruction of the perfect high society marriage. Julian slowly turned his body to face his wife. His eyes were completely hollow, entirely devoid of any human emotion. He finally realized that he was never the brilliant criminal mastermind he thought he was. He was just a pathetic, weak pawn being aggressively manipulated by a highly functioning sociopath. He had sacrificed his own father, his own morality, and his entire future for a woman who felt absolutely nothing for him. Chloe looked at her broken husband, and she knew the elaborate theatrical performance was completely over. She finally dropped her fake innocent facade completely. Her face hardened into a mask of pure cold survival instinct. She realized the federal agents were waiting outside, but her desperate mind refused to accept total defeat. She turned around, abandoning her family, abandoning her husband, and abandoning her son. She picked up the heavy skirt of her expensive designer dress and bolted directly toward the front doors. She tried to run away from the catastrophic mess she had meticulously created. But Julian completely snapped. The betrayal ignited an explosive, violent rage deep inside his broken mind. He let out a loud, terrifying, guttural roar that echoed through the entire mansion. He lunged forward across the polished hardwood floor. He reached out with large hands and grabbed the back of her designer dress with terrifying, violent force. He yanked her backward, completely stopping her desperate escape. Absolute total chaos erupted instantly in the dining room as the wealthy guests screamed aloud in pure terror. Julian grabbed the back of Chloe's expensive designer dress with terrifying, violent force. The delicate white silk fabric ripped loudly, echoing over the frantic screams of the wealthy guests. Chloe lost her balance and crashed heavily onto the polished marble floor of the grand foyer. She did not surrender. She twisted her body around like a feral cornered animal and began kicking wildly at her husband. Her designer heels struck Julian directly in the shins and knees. Julian collapsed on top of her, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He grabbed her wrists, pinning her manicured hands to the cold stone floor. "You were going to leave me," Julian screamed, his voice completely unrecognizable, breaking into a hysterical sobbing roar. "You set me up to rot in a federal prison while you stole my money. You are a monster, Chloe. I gave you absolutely everything." Chloe spat directly into his face, her perfectly applied makeup smeared across her cheeks, completely destroying her flawless high society aesthetic. "You are a pathetic, weak fool, Julian," she shrieked, thrashing violently beneath his heavy grip. "You deserve to go to prison. You could not even stand up to your own father without my help. I built this entire empire, and you were nothing but a convenient signature." The corporate lawyers and venture capitalists pressed their backs tightly against the walls of the grand dining room, watching the horrifying domestic violence unfold. They were completely trapped inside a mansion that had suddenly transformed into an active war zone. Donovan Vance tried to push himself up from the dining chair to intervene, but his massive chest heaved with exhaustion and sheer panic. And then the final catastrophic blow was delivered. It did not come from Julian or Chloe. It came directly from the front porch. A massive, deafening explosion of splintering wood and shattering glass completely drowned out the screaming couple. The heavy custom mahogany double doors were violently breached from the outside with a heavy steel tactical battering ram. The doors blew off their reinforced hinges and crashed brutally onto the marble floor of the foyer. This was not the local police department arriving to investigate a fake report about a stolen diamond necklace. This was the absolute crushing weight of the United States federal government making its grand, undeniable entrance into the fraudulent estate. A dozen federal agents completely swarmed the grand foyer and poured directly into the dining room. They were wearing heavy, dark navy tactical gear, thick bulletproof vests, and Kevlar helmets. The bright yellow letters of the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation were printed boldly across their backs. They moved with absolute flawless military precision, carrying heavy tactical rifles and shouting authoritative commands that shook the crystal chandeliers hanging from the high vaulted ceilings. "Get down on the ground right now," the lead tactical agent roared, sweeping the room with the red laser sight of his weapon. "Nobody moves a single muscle. Keep your hands exactly where I can see them." The wealthy elites who had spent their entire lives commanding boardrooms and demanding absolute obedience instantly dropped to their knees on the hardwood floor. Venture capitalists in expensive cashmere sweaters cowered in absolute terror, covering their heads with their trembling hands. The illusion of their untouchable wealth vanished in a single, terrifying second. Two heavily armored federal agents rushed directly toward the screaming couple rolling on the marble floor. They did not show Julian or Chloe an ounce of gentle respect. They grabbed Julian by his tailored suit jacket and yanked him violently off his wife, throwing him face first against the cold stone floor. A third agent pinned Chloe to the ground, pressing a heavy tactical knee between her shoulder blades to completely neutralize her violent thrashing. Donovan Vance completely lost whatever tiny shred of rational thought he had left. The arrogant, racist real estate developer refused to accept that federal agents were aggressively handling his daughter in a house he helped finance. He pushed himself out of his dining chair and charged toward the tactical team, his face turning a dark, violent purple. "Get your hands off my daughter, you pathetic government thugs!" Donovan bellowed, raising his massive fists in the air. "I am Donovan Vance. I will have your badges stripped and I will sue this entire department into absolute bankruptcy. You do not have the right to invade this private property." The federal agents did not hesitate for a single microsecond. "You do not threaten federal officers executing a no-knock asset seizure warrant." Two tactical agents stepped smoothly into Donovan's path. One agent grabbed his extended arm, twisting it sharply behind his massive back, while the other agent swept his thick legs completely out from under him. Donovan hit the hardwood floor with a massive, sickening thud that rattled the expensive china sitting on the dining table. Aggressive interference and assaulting a federal officer, the agent shouted, driving his knee into Donovan's lower back. "You are under arrest, sir." The sharp metallic clicking of heavy steel handcuffs echoed across the room as Donovan, Julian, and Chloe were all simultaneously restrained and completely neutralized by the overwhelming federal force. The chaos in the room was completely overwhelming, but I remained standing perfectly still in the dark hallway just outside the kitchen doors. I did not flinch. I did not back away. I watched the flawless execution of the tactical raid with deep professional satisfaction. The lead investigator stepped through the shattered remains of the front doors. He was a tall, sharp man wearing a tailored dark suit beneath a lightweight tactical vest. It was Senior Agent Vance, a highly respected operative I had personally trained during my final years at the Department of Justice. He walked past the crying venture capitalists and stepped over the completely ruined designer clothes of my son and daughter-in-law. He walked directly up to me, stopping just 2 feet away. He looked at my faded gray cardigan and my scuffed orthopedic shoes, and he smiled a brief, highly respectful smile. "Good afternoon, Curtis." Agent Vance said, his voice calm and entirely professional amidst the screaming and crying filling the massive mansion. "It looks like you managed to catch a remarkably loud and messy group of financial parasites today." I reached into the deep pocket of my worn cardigan. I bypassed the thick manila envelope and pulled out a small, heavy, encrypted digital hard drive. It was the master copy of the entire forensic investigation. It contained every single digital blood trail, every single forged signature, and the high-definition security footage of Chloe trying to blow up the house. I held the small black drive out and placed it firmly into his gloved hand. "Everything is here." "Agent Vance," I replied, my voice completely steady and resonant, conveying absolute authority. "You will find the complete corporate ledgers, the offshore proxy routing numbers, and the undeniable proof of massive federal identity theft. I highly suggest you start by looking at the Cayman Island trust account registered to the young woman screaming on the floor over there." Agent Vance secured the encrypted hard drive inside an evidence pouch on his tactical vest. "We have the perimeter completely secured, and the asset freeze protocols are already fully active," he confirmed, nodding deeply. "You did an absolutely spectacular job, Curtis. Your country owes you a massive debt of gratitude for bringing this entire syndicate down from the inside. Enjoy your retirement, sir." I turned my head and looked back into the grand dining room. Julian and Chloe were being aggressively hauled up to their feet by the federal agents. Their hands were tightly bound behind their backs with heavy steel handcuffs. They were dragged to the center of the room and forced to stand right in front of the massive mahogany dining table. Sitting perfectly untouched in the center of the table was the extravagant roasted Thanksgiving turkey, surrounded by expensive truffles and imported wine. It was the absolute ultimate poetic justice. They had planned to sit at that table and celebrate their stolen wealth while mocking a frail old man in the dark hallway. Now they were chained like common street criminals, forced to stare at the luxurious feast they would never get to taste. Julian looked across the room, and his terrified, bloodshot eyes locked directly onto mine. The absolute realization of his permanent destruction was completely evident on his sweating face. He saw me standing there casually speaking to the lead federal agent, and he finally understood that his own father was the undisputed architect of his total ruin. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg for mercy one last time, but a tactical agent shoved him forward, silencing him completely. Chloe did not look at me. She stared blankly at the floor, her mascara running down her face in thick, dark streaks, her luxurious escape plan reduced to absolute ashes. Donovan Vance was dragged out the front doors, sobbing uncontrollably about his frozen bank accounts. Agent Vance turned his attention to the 40 wealthy guests kneeling on the floor. "Nobody leaves this premises," Agent Vance ordered loudly, his voice booming with undeniable authority. "Every single person in this room is being officially detained for questioning regarding their financial ties to Curtis Holdings and the Vance Real Estate Syndicate. Collect their phones and begin the formal interrogations right now." The corporate lawyers began weeping openly, realizing their own lucrative careers were now highly compromised just by being in the room. The absolute destruction was completely flawless and undeniably absolute. I stood tall in my faded cardigan, watching the federal agents completely dismantle the fraudulent empire. The frail old man in the basement was gone forever, and the master forensic accountant had entirely reclaimed his stolen life.